Well, hi there, Van Halen fans. And welcome back to what I have chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. Now, as before, with the Van Halen wildlife balance between talking VH and talking Cameron Crowe, there's going to be a mixture of discussion in the usual manner of my narration on this show, as I normally would, with just myself citing some sources and reading into the history of the artist. There is also the continuation of my recorded interview by my friend Eve Clark of the band Trip the Wire, if you're ever up here in the Northwest and want to see some female-fronted hard rock that sounds awesome. Or you can support them on YouTube. You can support them on streaming services as well. Check them out. And there will also be interstitial bits and pieces of my live real-time reactions to watching the film The Wildlife. And again, I have treated the speed of those reactions electronically somewhat in ways that I think would hopefully make them more interesting to listen to. And if you didn't like those last time, if it's any consolation, I have spread them out into only 2 to 3 minute chunks at a time. So, go grab a smoke or something when those parts come on. Or just hit that 30 seconds ahead button about 4 times and you'll be past it. If you don't want to hear what sounds like me watching a movie and figuring it out in real time while sounding electronically about as pilled up as a Champion sweater after the first wash cycle. As with my recent Guns N' Roses episodes, I have to admit that this little excursion into Van Halen history, especially with the research I did for this second episode, led me to a lot more sympathy and admiration for David Lee Roth. That was a bit of a surprise. I usually just side with the guitar player all the time, no matter what. And to sort of balance that out, I've included some more Eddie Van Halen specific, references and resources and conversation and history as well. But rest assured, if you care about the history of Van Halen, I think there's something in every segment of this episode, whether it's coming from one person's perspective or another person's perspective, or focusing on interviewing one person over the other. But don't take my word for it. Have a listen for yourself, which is what you clearly came here to do, because that's why you pushed play. As I've said before, and as I always like reminding my audience, it's not just about going back into the history of a band or an artist. It's not just about, reviewing what they've accomplished. It's also really, really important, I think, to analyze the context of how they were received in their time compared to other art by what we will call journalists, people that get paid on a daily or weekly or monthly basis to tell people what they should like. Here's one from August 3rd, 1978. All I have is Lubbock, Texas for the source, other than the byline is by Doug Pullen, UD Entertainment Editor. And the headline reads, "Concert typifies death of hard rock. Again. Again, it is 1978. Van Halen's debut appearance here Thursday was a blinding example of overkill on the part of a record company. If the band's concert was typical of hard rock's latest directions, then the genre is about to go 6 feet under. Pause. I would like to also reiterate from a previous episode My memory of sitting in the bathroom of the Trading Musician in Seattle, Washington, when I worked there as a guitar repair person in the early 2000s, reading an ancient collection of Rolling Stone articles about their sort of like, it's a big collection of history of our rock coverage and such. And it was published in the early 80s, and it had a bit where it said, heavy metal finally is justifiably dead and hopefully won't come back ever again, which was hilarious because that bit was written before. If I recall correctly, that was written before Ozzy Osbourne's solo career went huge and Judas Priest went mainstream and Iron Maiden took over America for a while. So much about rock journalism, establishment rock journalism, has just been, fuck you, heavy metal. Fuck you, hard rock. Like, fuck you if you're not David Bowie or the New York Dolls or something subversive. You're like, fuck you if you're Kiss. I'm an old man, and I'm on all sides of that stuff. I love all of it. I love the transgressive stuff. I love the Ramones to death. They were one of those typical bands that they weren't a typical band. They were very atypical, but they were a band that was typical of the press loves them, but the public didn't until decades later. But, AC/DC, fuck you. One of the greatest rock bands of all time. Black Sabbath, boo. Oh, God. One of the most important bands to ever exist in the modern era. Black Sabbath. Just when that many critics and journalists hate you, you're probably onto something. No, you don't. Actually, I'll take it back. There's a lot of shit that journalists hate that probably sucks too. Whatever. I don't want to speak in absolutes like a Sith. So it goes on to say, that's not to say Van Halen's concert was terrible. It wasn't. So what's your fucking problem? This piece is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs, and they're very short. Each paragraph is 2 sentences. I mean, good. But Van Halen's show continues a pattern being established by several other performers of hard rock. Aerosmith, for one example. The sound is over-amplified. The visuals, you could hear me almost say oversimplified, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. Over-amplified. The visuals are unimaginative and dull because, apparently rock and roll is supposed to be full of... It all has to be full of pageantry. All of it. It all has to be like a local production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Good Lord. The visuals. What were the visuals of Chuck Berry, you piece of shit? What were the visuals of Bo Diddley and Jerry Lee Lewis? You got 4 guys on stage, and they're all way more active than the average rock person of the time. Oh, goodness gracious! But you want what do you want changing of sets, like backdrops changing on every song or something? Synchronized light systems in 1978 from a band that just put out their first album. Christ. In seeing Van Halen, one must understand that this is a relatively new band forming only 4 years ago in California. Its first album. That is what we call an othering right there. Not there. He won't say there, Doug Pullen. He says its first album because he wants you to think of it as a thing. Like the Loch Ness Monster is an it. Van Halen is not an it. You douchebag. Its first album has been on the stands since March and earned enough in sales to receive a gold record award. But sales and image, get ready for it, mean nothing when it comes to music. Get ready for it again. Van Halen depends too heavily on guitarist Edward Van Halen. Tell me you don't pay attention to the rhythm section without telling me you don't pay attention to the rhythm section. Doug Pullen. Not that his work isn't sufficient. I'm out. I'm going to kill somebody.
Oh, shit. This is where the DeCarlo dick down begins.
No DeCarlo dick down. Sorry. Thank you, Max, for stepping in and reminding me how close I am to flying off the handle and making something terrible happen. Okay, I'll go back to reading. I'll go back to it. But like his charts, Edward Van Halen is wet behind the ears. His songwriting lacks depth, and on stage, he gets repetitious. Singer David Roth isn't much better. Known for his vibrant presence on stage, Roth was surprisingly slow to warm to a boisterous crowd in the Municipal Auditorium. Not even a sellout crowd seemed to draw genuine enthusiasm from the group. Apparently last Thursday's show was just another gig on a long row of one-nighters as far as the band was concerned. And Doug Pullen, UD Entertainment editor, is out.
Oh, spilling the bad news. Anita's got an older boyfriend. And up till now, Eric Stoltz was the Apostle Peter as an angel in Prophecy, I'm thinking of. He was really good in that. Obviously, he was great in Pulp Fiction. But funny that he's the ex-boyfriend of Anita in this movie because she's about to be in Back to the Future, and he had tested for the part of Marty McFly and gotten the job, and they had recorded I think a few hours of footage of him playing the character, and then decided to switch and go with Michael J. Fox instead. Obviously they kept Leah Thompson. Hopefully nothing bad between them happened on this show. But here's where we get here's where we get the insecure indicators that his character maybe isn't such a great guy. I mean, he probably hasn't done anything bad to his girlfriend. He's just real fucking possessive for somebody that's not going out with this gal. Oh. And okay. Well, the power to my my whole unit just went off. This lights are flashing in here. Obviously the recorder is still on because it's on a different outlet, but something's going on over on the other side of my living room. Huh. Weird.
Oh, shit. This is where the DeCarlo dick down begins.
I guess that's a good enough place to stop for now. This is not going to be a real-time watch-along now. We're 20 minutes in. Shoot. What are you going to do? Fate. There's no fate but what we make, except for the fact that fate and the electrical grid here in Linwood, Washington has now just decided that I'm done following along with the film for the time being.
Cool. All right.
Oh,
So
microphone. You have yours already.
Yep.
I'm ready. See, once I start talking like that, it's just hard to stop.
Ready? Yeah.
And I get really nasty too. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking? What are you looking at? I just get to be a bitch when I get that accent. I'm like, fuck you.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk. Are we on 3 now? Or is there
We
something
are.
you wanted to
we
say
didn't do
one
the
more?
clap on the second one. I
Oh,
don't
we
think.
didn't. I'll figure it out.
Right. We'll have to clap.
We'll clap on 4. 1, 2, 3.
Say on 4 or after 4. Oh,
We got good timing. Look
lethal
at that.
weaponry
We didn't have a metronome.
Yeah. We got rhythm. Okay. So we've done Van Halen 1, done Van Halen 2. Now, of course, it is time for longer songs, less catchy, long intros, more piano, and a new singer named Gary Cherone, who will not be heard from in the Van Halen world after this album comes out. Am I thinking of the right Van Halen 3, right? We did Van Halen 1, Van Halen 2, Van Halen 3?
Women and children first.
That one! So Women and Children First, there's a lot on this record I hadn't listened to in a long time, I have to admit. And this one does go off into some really cool territory that shows Van Halen is not just great at being Van Halen to the nth degree. They can do things that sound less Van Halen-y and still rule at it. And that was sort of the main takeaway I had with this. I noticed in Fools, for the first time, maybe not the first time, but to me, it was like David Lee Roth is doing a bit more of a Chuck Berry thing where his protagonist that he's portraying is a little more under duress, is a little more like downtrodden, or he's trying to, like, people are hassling him, and I think of those Chuck Berry songs about being in school and trying to get out and get away from your parents and not being bothered by adults and stuff, and this is the first, like I said, might be wrong, but in the 1, 2, and Women and Children First sort of order of things, first time I noticed David Lee Roth's lyrics being a little more like, they're not sad, they're just like, he's not on top and he's not the aggressor in this one. This would be like the basis of entire like half of the, I don't know, like some bands would do like half of their hits with this sort of everyman perspective, like, oh, you're trying to get out and have a good time, like Nothing But a Good Time by Poison, like, everyone leave me alone, I'm trying to go do my thing and I want to party, kind of a thing. I also noticed on Everybody Wants Some, they only, going back to Dave, like, Dave gets like 2 lines in and it's time for the band to change what they're doing. Like, he says 2 things, boom, ba, boom, ba, so that he says a couple of weird, wacky things, and then it's time to get loud again and play something that this crowd can sing along with. When they're smart about when they do these cool Dave moments where Dave's making funny noises, it doesn't go on very long. Like, it doesn't get boring, because then they do something like, everybody wants some, that the release is right away. The cymbals come crashing in and the big chords come in, and there's something for the whole crowd to like sing along with, and it has to be a conscious choice that kind of comes from playing so many parties and having such a good time at the shows and not wanting to get too arty-farty, and also not wanting to have too much of one thing happening for too long. But you still do notice all across the first 3 records the David Lee Roth sort of lesson that he taught them back in the day when they were playing to make people dance is, you don't go faster than whatever 100 and something beats per minute, because then the girls aren't going to shake their butts anymore, and if the girls aren't shaking their butts, then the guys aren't buying them drinks, and if the guys aren't, like, this has to be something. There's a lot of other bands that start out one way and then they get really popular, and then they have larger crowds and they realize, oh, we can't play complicated stuff now. We need to. Pantera is a great example of this. Like, they have to be able to like react to us physically from the front to the back of the arena now. We're not playing clubs and theaters trying to impress people because we're opening for Judas Priest with our musicianship. Now it's time for, down to love, or jun 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 da 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 da. It's not da 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 da. Van Halen like already knew that, but other bands that already knew that, like that were catchy and danceable, didn't have the level of athletic musicianship that Van Halen had to sort of balance things out with. That's the magic that not enough folks talk about. The Van Halen, no one could be like them really, because there was just the strange combination of the push and the pull of catchy, sing-alongable, dance-alongable, and then musically incredibly impressive. I mean, to use Extreme as an example,
you get a lot of their stuff is catchy and danceable for a certain audience. A lot of it is only going to work for a hard rock audience, albeit there's plenty of melody there and there's plenty of groove there, right? But it's a different kind of groove. It's a little more. I guess I'm just veering off into non-Van Halen territory, so it's irrelevant. But that is the balance that Van Halen strikes so well.
I want to talk some more about the clubs that Van Halen was playing before the Gazzarri's and Starwood era kicked in. Two of them, out of the three that I've noticed the most info written about, the most stories so far, are The Rock and Walter Mitty's Rock and Roll Emporium. Another one was called The Golden West. They have a few stories about playing that place, but for now, I'm going to focus on the first two and even give you a surprise in the form of actual quotes from Alex Van Halen, which I don't run across very often when doing this research. So we'll get to that here in a minute after we set things up. Now, this place called Walter Mitty's Rock and Roll Emporium is where Van Halen's starting to play pretty regularly in '76. This is a time when a lot of Van Halen fans are folks that live in the San Gabriel Valley, and Walter Mitty's is in Pomona. The author of Van Halen Rising describes it as 50 miles away from Van Nuys, and they get the gig through a mutual friend in a band called Stormer. His name is Gene Simmons, and he helps Van Halen get in, introduces them on stage the first night that they play there. Now, for those that don't know the sort of layout of Los Angeles and the various cities within Los Angeles, various names and how big and expansive the LA area is, the place is kind of described as this sort of industrial sort of wasteland area. It is pretty. It's not a flashy place, let's say that. There's a big, huge dirt parking lot that turns to total mud whenever it rains. The place is always frequented by tons and tons of bikers. Like, people get in fights out front of this place trying to get parking because there's so many bikes lined up on both sides of the street, and people with cars get pissed off for how far they have to, park away from the front door. And there's chain link barbed wire fence around a lot of the buildings surrounding the place. Places like General Dynamics across the street, which is a military contractor, manufacturing plant, frontage for some trailer parks, liquor store, a couple of other bars, adult bookstore, and then an evangelical church, the Pomona Revival Center. So Mitty's customers were pretty well known for just coming in the evenings and, doing whatever the hell they wanted to the place and around the place and to any citizens that would, be hapless enough to be nearby. Inside, the floor is always sticky. The place is always smelly from stale beer and cigarettes. And they're trying to get, their San Gabriel Valley fans to come down and see them in Pomona. But a lot of them are pretty young still, and they haven't been into clubs that feel this sort of intimidating or dark and adult and hopeless, maybe. These are my words. No one else's. But it's very intimidating for their party friends, that are fresh out of high school or a local community college or something, to then suddenly, be filling up this place that's just full of older bikers that are prone to violence, shall we say. This is where Van Halen witnesses their first disemboweling, let's say. I don't know how many disembowelings they personally witnessed over the course of their career, but evidently this was the first one that took place at Walter Mitty's. So a guy named Kerry Irwin says that Walter Mitty's became this real hip place for all these bands to play at, but there were quite frequently severe fights. I remember one night I went there, some guy got thrown through a plate glass window and cut his neck really bad. It turned into a big deal. Eddie remembers one time late in the evening, we just saw a guy's intestines hanging out of his gut. As the band watched in horror, this is from, the narrative of Van Halen Rising by Greg Renoff. As the band watched in horror, the stricken man reeled away from his knife-wielding attacker and then fell to the ground. There was blood everywhere, says Eddie. David Lee Roth would say in his autobiography that the club's lights suddenly came on and Van Halen quickly left the stage. But the next night, he says, rumors raged that certain aggrieved bikers were coming back to exact revenge. Van Halen still performed, but just to play it safe, they pulled the amplifiers a few more feet away from the walls than usual in case we had to jump behind the amps if there was a shootout. Another quote from around this era when it comes to the perception of David Lee Roth as their frontman, that is, it's echoed a few times. People saying things like, who's this guy in front that can't really sing very well? And why is he trying to do this act or look like Jim Dandy? There's a lot of that. There's a lot of quotes like that. The women, when asked, when it comes to people that work in clubs or promote shows, they're like, David Lee Roth was a god and girls loved him and they would press up close to the stage and watch everything he did. He wore hip huggers, no shirt and a bandana, and he was sexy as hell. Well, the guys all tend to say, he wasn't a very good singer, and he was doing this ripoff of Jim Dandy, who's the singer from a band called Black Oak, Arkansas. If you didn't grow up with 70s rock, or you didn't have people in your life that grew up with 70s rock playing it for you, you might not know, as I didn't, that Black Oak, Arkansas was a very popular band, but they didn't have a ton of hits. I only knew them because of the Dazed and Confused soundtrack. Jim Dandy to the rescue was a great tune. It's fun. It's a bit, to my ears as a teenager in the 90s, of course, it was a bit of a novelty sounding song, right? But the thing is, David Lee Roth was not the only guy taking his cues from that dude as to how to craft a stage presence and what kind of a look to have. And plenty of people have also pointed out that, he did stand out as being very effective at that at a time when all the other guys in Hollywood were trying real hard to be David Bowie. And it was sort of like a lot of frontmen are doing one thing or the other, the long-haired, bare-chested Tarzan thing, or the androgynous, makeup and short hair and like silk clothes thing. So Alex, talking to the magazine Modern Drummer about this era in the band's development, says, we went out and played and played and played. Sure, we didn't have any money, and sure, this broke down, and sure, there were lousy people. And that's the statement. Sure, this broke down. I don't know what he's referring to, but lousy people we had to work with, such as pseudo-managers and club owners. But the audiences were always there, and it was a great time. Some people call it paying your dues, but we just called it having fun. We had a good time. I wouldn't have wanted it any different. Roth would say to the LA Times, we were happy playing all the clubs. We were working towards something. We were hungry. We were accomplishing things. Alex would also say, to me, Mitty's was the epitome of a rock and roll club. And every night we played there, I had this vision that we were playing some sort of large arena. Michael Anthony would say the place held 300 people and we'd have 700. 1,000 people inside. It was your ultimate sweaty small stage, and their lineup in Van Halen used to get a great sound in that place. When we were grooving, the whole club would be happening. And if the stories about biker violence and and the predominant use of lots and lots of pills there, they in the book they talk about how like cocaine was a Hollywood drug. It's too expensive. Someone says, oh, you'd split an 8-ball with somebody because it was all you could, because you couldn't really afford to buy an entire one yourself. You'd only get high for an hour, but you'd take downers and you'd be buzzing all night or whatever. So there's like Seconal and Quaaludes, there's Black Beauties, things like that. There's just pills freely being distributed and thrown around. To further, explain or exemplify the fact that this was a different time, even the owner of the place, Larry Ward, told his 16-year-old daughter she had to come with him down to the club to see this amazing band, Van Halen. She shows up early in the evening. She says people were lining up down the street and down around the building to get inside. And her father sneaks in his underage kid saying, keep your head down. Don't let anyone see you too much. She says Van Halen would just pack my dad's bar. It was all you could do just to get in the door. It would be standing room only. Once you got inside, all you could do was stand up and just look. There was no sitting down in the place that night. Leslie Ward goes on to say that, she was just mesmerized to hear this sound that was so different from everybody else, and to hear it live like that. They were so good. And again, different times, she goes outside to have a smoke. This underage kid, just staying close to her father's bouncer, a guy named Bear. She says there was all these bikes parked up and down the sidewalk. These guys would come out and they'd have chains coming out of their pockets, big white leather straps around their wrists, wearing vests and jeans and big, thick leather boots, long hair and long beards. They were pretty rough. They were intimidating. She says the police and fire department used to come a lot for the place being over capacity and the noise. When David and Eddie's band was there, it was a given. You almost expected them to show up. Again, different time. David Lee Roth would routinely hop off the stage with his long microphone cable and just storm into the ladies' room during a song, and then speak to the women that were all pissed off at him inside, asking them to show him their IDs in order to confirm that they were of age, as bikers would peek through the doorway and cheer. People in the crowd would laugh. He'd return to the stage, continue, singing the set, and they were doing stuff from old Rod Stewart to the Ohio players, and also Led Zeppelin and Bad Company in these sets, as well as their own originals. By 1975, they had a pretty strong following down there in Pomona.
Okay, wait a second. Now I have to strike something I said a minute ago from the record. The young dude playing the badass kid that's obsessed with the 60s and smoking a cigarette and stuff is, I think, miscredited on IMDb, and that was my confusion. Because he shows up on IMDb as Bryn Berliner, known for the wildlife, and then there's no other information. However, Ilan Mitchell-Smith is the name I'm finding when I'm Google searching other photos of the character online, and Ilan Mitchell-Smith is a dude that went on to be in Weird Science. He was also in a movie called The Chocolate War with one of, I believe, the co-stars of this film, Jenny Wright. She is a whole story in and of herself that I have to get into, because she's in one of my favorite movies, Near Dark, directed by Catherine Bigelow, a Point Break directorial excursion from a time when Catherine Bigelow was still coupled up with Mr. James Cameron, and by her own admission basically went to him and said, hey, can I steal like half your cast of aliens now that you're done with them, and then go make a vampire movie that takes place in Oklahoma? And she grabbed, Jeanette Goldstein and Bill Paxton and the always amazing Lance Henriksen, and made a badass film with this young woman, Jenny Wright, who kind of disappeared from acting for quite a while, unfortunately. She did The World According to Garp in 82. She did Pink Floyd's The Wall in 82. She's the groupie that shows up and comes to Pink's hotel room, you know, want to take a bath. And she was in Young Guns 2 as Jane Greathouse. And then there's a string of TV appearances, you know, I think one-off stuff. Matlock, Sirens, NYPD Blue. She was also in The Lawnmower Man. That appears to be, 1992 appears to be sort of the last thing in that sequence of her upward trajectory as an actress in film. And I don't know that she's, I mean, she seems to be doing better somehow, but I don't think she was doing great for a while. Based on what I'm seeing of a couple of recent interviews with her.
The Scorpions, to thinking about like who else is out there doing arenas and stuff in the late 70s. Scorpions didn't do it like that. They were catchy, yes, they were a little slower. They were bang your head and pump your fist kind of anthemic stuff. But I don't think they made girls want to take their clothes off. You know, I don't think Klaus Meine made girls want to, I mean, I'm sure plenty of Scorpions female fans wanted to do nice things to Klaus, but not, I don't think they had the charisma that someone like David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen. They're not, like, women are now invited to the party in hard rock and heavy metal. And I think I probably stole that phrase from Chuck Klosterman, who said it in one of those VH1 shows about heavy metal. But it's like, it's not dark. It's not too aggressive, but it doesn't take any shit either. That's sort of like the magic of Van Halen. There's no give when it comes to how aggressive they are at being great at their instruments and how impressive they are to watch them do their thing. But like plenty of people that aren't super into heavy metal don't need to know that. They just hear a song that they like, and like David Lee Roth's up there strutting around, and you know, and the other guys in the band they look like they're having fun. You know, it's not Black Sabbath, who clearly hate each other. They're just getting super stoned so they don't have to think about that person next to them that they don't like.
So how about a few short bursts of storytelling when it comes to the creation of Van Halen songs, and which ones ended up on which albums at what times? Dipping into a 2012 issue of Guitar World magazine with the cover story, the 50 greatest Van Halen songs of all time. And no, I will not read you all 50. I'll just go through a handful that I thought were interesting as I'm glancing back over them for the first time in 10, 11 years. Number 50 is Dance the Night Away from Van Halen 2. This was, it says, reportedly inspired by Fleetwood Mac's Go Your Own Way, and indeed the song is one of the few pure pop tunes of the DLR era. As such, the emphasis is heavily on the vocals and chorus harmonies. The title refrain was originally Dance, Lolita, Dance, until Roth was convinced otherwise. Though Eddie's guitar is uncharacteristically restrained, no solo, he still contributes some stellar harmonics work and a classic major chord riff. The number 48 selection is Top of the World for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. The opening riff sound familiar? That's because it's more or less the same one Ed played almost a decade earlier on the fade out to 1984's Jump. If you want to pause and go put that on just to check it, I'll wait. Are you back? All right, cool. Eddie didn't want Top of the World included on For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, preferring to focus on fresher material. Producer Andy Johns convinced him otherwise, but not before Eddie could pull out another blast from the past. He recorded the song using the 58 Gibson Flying V he played on another 1984 hit, Hot for Teacher. Cool stuff. I mean, that was probably their second or third single on MTV from that album, I think. Third or fourth. It may have come after. I would maybe it's fourth, because I know I saw Pound Cake, then I saw Run Around, then I want to say the third one that came out was the super huge, famous, in constant rotation and in a Crystal Pepsi commercial right now. The one that I hear in the soundtrack of The Wildlife played on some sequencer, a different kind of keyboard or whatever, which I believe I mentioned in the previous episode. Now, number 42, because it's an important number, being the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Finish What You Started from OU812. With its twangy fingerstyle guitar, dry drums, meaning no, you don't have a lot of echoes and reverbs on them. They're very clean and crisp sounding. Like AC/DC records are the sort of the industry standard for a dry drum sound that influenced, I don't know, the first half of Rick Rubin's producing career. Finish What You Started is easily the most un-Van Halen song in the band's catalog. Alex plunks on a kit that sounds like tuna cans as Eddie performs finger-licking, chicken-picking lines on a Fender Stratocaster plugged directly into the mixing console. Sammy's lyrics actually make sense for once, and it's easy to imagine a woman stopping him in the act when she realizes she's having sex with Sammy Hagar. Damn. I would like to also point out, I don't know who wrote this. I looked in the table of contents where this is listed. I don't see a byline. I've looked at the end of the article, and I've looked at the beginning of the article, and I don't see any one person credited for this. But along the way, there are also quotes from other famous guitarists or people from the guitar world or heavy metal world that are, have opinions on Van Halen. And here's one in the sidebar from Mr. Gene Simmons that'll be pertinent to remember at a later time in this Van Halen series that I'm presenting to you. While we were recording Creatures of the Night, I had lunch with Eddie. I can remember him pouring his heart out about how unhappy he was in Van Halen. And then this part, the editors have put in all caps. Eventually, he asked us if he could join Kiss. Let's see, number 38 is the song 5150 from 5150. After hearing the rapid-fire double stops, cascading drums that fill in the first minute of 5150, you'll wonder why Van Halen didn't just carry on as an instrumental trio. To his credit, Sammy squeals his highest note ever on the outro. But Eddie's solo is a stronger musical statement, a glorious 32-bar showcase of pure six-string skills. Let the man play all the synths he wants. This title track is his gift to his guitar fans. Let's get into the 30s. So here's something I didn't know about who helped write one of my favorite Van Halen songs of all time, which is one of their least Van Halen-y sort of songs. I apologize if I'm about to repeat myself here, because I may have said this when talking to Eve in the other audio, but I'll Wait, to me, is Van Halen's Gimme Shelter. It's like people think of the Rolling Stones as this fun rock and roll bar band that just happens to be a, arena selling out international monstrosity. But, they were like a down and dirty, sleazy rock and roll band that'll always get your hips moving. And to me, the Gimme Shelter is like one of the most evil things I've ever heard. Very sinister. Not a fun, not like, hey, it's time to party with the Rolling Stones. And that's how I feel about I'll Wait. I love how creepy it is. I love that it's Van Halen-y. Like only they could do it, I think. But it sounds so uncharacteristic compared to the rest of their catalog in a lot of ways. To anyone that's about to do, excuse me, you're neglecting to mention this song from Balance and this song from Another Kind of Truth and whatever. Or Van Halen 3 had a song that was also very atmospheric and oppressive and creepy. I don't care. I didn't listen to those the tracks that you're talking about. I don't have the attention span. I have all the good Van Halen I want to listen to. Thank you. I can be taught better. Yes, I can. I swear, but. Don't come at me with other creepy Van Halen songs because this one just hits the spot. And it says, though Jump is the 1984 cut commonly credited with igniting the to-keyboard or not-to-keyboard rift in the Van Halen camp, it was actually I'll Wait that, as Eddie recounted, David Lee Roth and producer Ted Templeman didn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. His quote. And indeed, whereas Jump is a guitar-based rocker at heart, I'll Wait is pure synth pop with Alex Van Halen on rototoms and a co-writer credit for ex-Doobie Brother crooner Michael McDonald to boot. Now at number 20, it's Dirty Movies from Fair Warning. It says, DLR spins a seedy tale of prom queen turned porn queen, and Eddie matches him with a suitably lewd-sounding guitar melody. Only his second slide performance, after Could This Be Magic, on a Van Halen record. Eddie cut the song on a modified Gibson SG, and if you don't know what that is, just think of AC/DC again. Think of the image of Angus Young running around in his schoolboy outfit. The guitar he's holding is the Gibson SG. So it's definitely a different body shape than what you're used to Van Halen playing. Also, great guitar for us short people. There's a reason why Angus plays it. Which underwent further alteration during the recording sections when the guitar's bottom horn impeded his ability to reach the uppermost frets with his slide. He recalled, I took a hacksaw right there in the studio and sawed it off. Pause for a second while I puts down this magazine. I reach behind myself for the Eruption book once again and flip to the page that is dedicated to that specific SG. Okay, here we go. Now, while flipping through the book, I actually caught just a quick glimpse of this question and answer portion that's not the Gibson SG part. It's later in the book. It says it's about for unlawful carnal knowledge. And the guy says, Top of the World features the riff you used on the fade out to Jump. And he goes, wow, you noticed that? I almost didn't put that on the record because everything else seemed so new and fresh. Andy forced me to put it in. He kept saying, I love that song. You have to put it on the record. I used my Hot for Teacher Gibson Flying V and my Marshall on that tune, which was cool. But to be honest, we had 5 other tunes that I would have preferred to use that didn't make it on the album. Well, did you use those later on the best ofs or Another Kind of Truth, Eddie? If only I could ask you. Let's see. So in a page, one pager about the 1962 Gibson SG TV Junior used slide guitar part on Dirty Movies from Fair Warning. And there's a picture of it. It looks to be like a very aged white. Maybe it's TV yellow. It's a black and white photograph. The white pickguard, one Gibson dog ear P90 pickup. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. And I don't think that's the stock bridge at all. So it's been modified with something more modern down there. He says, I used to play this TV Junior back in the clubs, in the band's club days, but it was a bitch to keep in tune. The neck is heavier than the body. Which is typical for Gibson SGs. If you're like standing still and it's, if you just let go of the guitar neck, the headstock will just tilt straight down to the ground if you don't catch it, because the body is so lightweight. I didn't play it for long because it's uncomfortable to play a guitar when you have to support the neck and play at the same time. The neck joint on TV Juniors often break, but this one never cracked or broke, which is surprising considering all the abuse I put it through. I took the guitar to Sunset Sound. We were recording Dirty Moves for Dirty Movies. Sorry, folks, for Fair Warning. Too much caffeine today. I used it to play the slide part. I kept recording takes over and over, and finally I asked Don Landy to get me a hacksaw. He asked me what I was going to do, and I told him not to worry about it. I hacked off the horn on the treble side because I couldn't hit the high notes with the slide. Everybody looked at me like I fell out of my tree, but it was by necessity. People trip when I do things like that right in front of them. I've destroyed a lot of vintage guitars over the years. Some people might think, how could you desecrate the Mona Lisa? But I don't really care what something looks like or if it's 100% stock. I tear things apart and try to make them work and do what I need them to do. I'm more concerned with a guitar's functionality, sound, and playability. The Consequence of Sound article about Cameron Crowe's films has a sort of better, more in-depth review of the wildlife, which is something, it's a movie that people like to give short shrift to and kind of move on to the really good stuff like Almost Famous, Fast Times, and Say Anything. Although I've never seen Say Anything, I know it's beloved. The Consequence of Sound article puts the wildlife at number 11. Which is interesting because it's also called Every Cameron Crowe Movie Ranked from Worst to Best. So it makes it the worst. Right below The Union in 2011, which is a behind-the-scenes look at the making of Elton John and Leon Russell's collaborative record produced by T-Bone Burnett. Huh. Oh, so it's just a straight-up documentary. And then We Bought a Zoo is number 9. Anyhow, the Wildlife Review has some good. It's broken up nicely. And it's it's a much more charismatic sort of approach to doing a movie write-up, I think. Let's see. The pitch. 3 high school buddies get together and have a debauched evening of LA hijinks as they meet colorful characters, go to a strip club, and have a big and crazy party in an apartment. Boy, what a wild life they lead. Or more honestly, what a dirty 80s teen sex comedy trope-laden life they lead. I would rather watch the movie that's being pitched as, because you could cut out honestly, you could cut out the little brother stuff. You could cut out everything leading up to the party and just make the movie about the party that night and the quest to make the party happen, maybe, and some troubles along the way that might prevent the party from happening. Then again, that's just Dazed and Confused by Richard Linklater, right? Which I think I reference in my live commentary while I'm watching the movie. Like, it should have been this instead. Not the coolest, most insightful critique in the world, I understand, from your host. You know what movie they should have made? One of the best movies of this entire genre ever. Yes, Jay, thank you. Would you also like to say Hamburger Hill should have been more like Platoon? Thanks for that, Jay Smith. So let's see. Cast: Chris Penn, Eric Stoltz, Elam Mitchell-Smith, Jenny Wright, Leah Thompson, Hart Bachner, Rick Moranis, Randy Quaid, Sherilyn Fenn, Kitten Natividad, and Ben Stein. Something Wilder. The closest thing to Wilder here is the fact that the title is The Wildlife. This is more John Landis than Wilder. This is a reference to Cameron Crowe's admiration for Billy Wilder, who's not a character I'm familiar with or a person historically or in the humanities I'm familiar with, but it's part of it's just part of the series of comparisons that the author is doing. The Consequence of Sound article originally appeared in 2017 in a publication called Dissected, or a website called Dissected, I guess. Let's see. Oh yeah, Crowe's Circle. As the story goes, early in his career, Eric Stoltz was promised a role in any film of Cameron Crowe's. Stoltz was in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, here in The Wildlife, Say Anything, Singles, as a mime. Stoltz was supposedly in Jerry Maguire, if you will recall. I can't. He was almost in Almost Famous as David Bowie, but it didn't work out. Then again, Stoltz was not in Elizabethtown or We Bought a Zoo, and he isn't in Aloha. Geez, that promise didn't last. Oh well. Soundtrack of Your Life. The soundtrack was all a little kitsch. And Steppenwolf's Born to Be Wild, serving as the focal tune, kind of ensured that this wouldn't be as well remembered as Fast Times' catchy music. Billy Idol, Little Richard, Bananarama, Huey Lewis, Stevie Wonder, Prince, Jimi Hendrix, Ron Wood, Madonna. Goodness, that would be a ridiculously expensive soundtrack today. Oh, and Eddie Van Halen worked on the score. That's a lot of brand names, but so little identity can be found on this soundtrack. It's like finding someone's classic jams mix after learning about popular music of the 60s within the 80s. Which almost makes sense. The script evolved out of Crowe's fascination for the Doors and his interest with 60s culture. Thus the awkward blend. Pen on Pen. Sean Penn's late brother, Chris, credited as Christopher, was the co-lead of this pseudo-sequel to Crowe's Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Chris apparently hung out on the set of Fast Times, and Crowe liked both of them so much that when the time came for this feature, Crowe gave a push for Sean's little brother. The Penn family motto must have been, "Hey, bud, let's party with Cameron Crowe if the casting works out, which it will." Who the hell is Art Linson? The guy Robert De Niro played in What Just Happened. That's who. The IMDb trivia says that super producer Art Linson stepped in to direct only after the first director walked, and the studio threatened to cancel the film. All Google searches for who the director was have been disappointing, but know that this was the last movie Linson directed. Analysis. While Fast Times at Ridgemont High was accused of being a tawdry expose about the lives of California teens, at least that chapter in Crowe's writing had a distinct ear, not to mention memorability, to the proceedings. It was a teen sex flick, but one with something to report, and it wasn't some dumb, idealized vision of youth. And that was written by Blake Goebel for Consequence of Sound. If you want to check that out, just do a search for Cameron Crowe movies ranked from worst to best if you want. Class. That's funny and memorable. A permed Chris Penn, sorry guys. A permed Chris Penn's Tom Drake scopes out a babe's boobs from outside her window. It's not that funny and feels like a ripoff of Animal House. I would agree with that. Less charming. Either way, the wildlife is like the contractually obligated Crowe script that time forgot. His undisciplined id laying with cheap thrills before he got a chance to express himself like a human storyteller in 1989. Most Van Halen fans that have dipped into the lore at all and the history know about how Gene Simmons at one point recorded the band, made a demo with them, wanted to manage them, and eventually had to bail because the other members of Kiss and his manager Bill Aucoin were annoyed that he was spending so much time outside of Kiss focusing on other bands that these other guys weren't concerned with, and that he needed to refocus back on Kiss. Bill Aucoin himself supposedly told Gene that, no one knows who these guys are. It's not worth spending your time. And Gene Simmons saying, "I'm going to make you eat those words," or "You're going to eat those words." Now, one thing I didn't know was that Paul and Gene got turned on to Van Halen because they were hanging around with Rodney Bingenheimer and Lita Ford and Jackie Fox of the Runaways, who, of course, Bingenheimer helped, get that band together and helped them to be seen and heard. They all emphatically, were basically urging Paul and Gene to go check out Van Halen because it was their favorite local band. Another thing I didn't know about this time was that Van Halen wasn't the only band in the running for Gene's attention. The other band that he was considering on the same night, basically, was a band called The Boys with a Z that featured George Lynch and drummer Mick Brown, who would go on to create, would be in Dokken later. Now, Van Halen was playing Gazzarri's when Bingenheimer got into them. Then he saw them at the Pasadena Civic Center, and then saw them at the Starwood. So it's not like a one-off thing. Like, he didn't just get blown away by one performance. He was, following the band's exploits pretty closely. And it turns out also that Jackie Fox, when pressed, had to admit that she thought The Boys would have been a better band for Gene and Paul to go with because they seemed more, mainstream sounding and a little less wild and threatening. She liked Van Halen better because they were doing things that nobody else was doing. So Gene and Paul find out that The Boys are going to be playing a Halloween party at Gazzarri's on a Wednesday night on October 27th of that year. And they decided to go check it out. It's 1976. The public had no idea yet what the members of KISS looked like when they were not in uniform and with makeup on. So it's just two dark-haired guys and an entourage walk in the club and don't really attract a lot of attention. There's a band playing called Eulogy, and the singer Miles Crowe, C-R-A-W, says, on any given night, there were like 4 bands playing. We play a couple of sets throughout the night, so it was a constant barrage of music. As all bands did at Gazzarri's, I'm reading straight from Van Halen Rising here by Greg Ranoff. Eulogy played covers, including the KISS anthem, Rock and Roll All Night. I have to pronounce it that way when it's spelled N-I-T-E. Night. After they came off stage, a man with dark curly hair approached them. A guy walked up to us and introduced himself as Paul Stanley from KISS, Crowley says. We were like, yeah, come on, no way. But it turned out it was Paul and Gene Simmons. They just happened to be there that night checking out all the bands. After wishing Eulogy well, Gene headed upstairs to catch the Boys' performance. The band's singer, Michael White, remembers KISS was absolutely at the peak of their popularity in the fall of '76. Everyone came down dressed as KISS. I'm not exaggerating. Probably 90% of the kids came dressed in KISS makeup and costumes because it's Halloween and it's, a rock club. That makes sense. When we saw all those kids dressed like that, as a joke, we said, let's add a couple of KISS songs to the set. We used to do Firehouse when we sound checked. We used to do Firehouse when we sound checked. We also threw Detroit Rock City into the set. We did those 2 songs to end the set. Between sets, God, I said the word set 3 times in 5 seconds. A stranger approached White. I'm standing around after the set, and this fucking huge guy walks up to me and says, hi, I'm Gene Simmons. I really like the way you did you did our songs. I knew it was Gene once I looked at him. Paul was there too. Some guy they were with handed me a business card from Casablanca Records. I still have that card. Goddamn right you do. Gene Simmons then asked, where are you playing next? I liked your act. I'd like to bring some record company people down to see you. A wide-eyed White replied, this Tuesday we're playing at the Starwood. So they just played a Wednesday at Gazzarri's, and then they're playing 5 days later, early in the week. Popular folks. Okay, I'll be there with the record company. You guys be ready. With that, Simmons, Stanley, and others departed. A stunned White tracked down his bandmates, Lynch, Brown, and bassist Monty Zufelt. He told them what had just happened. But assuming he was pulling a practical joke, they told White to stop fucking around. When White showed them the card, the quartet got gleeful. Everyone was all excited, White says. They exchanged high fives and yelled. This is not good writing. They exchanged high fives and yelled. It sounds like a scene from Tommy Wiseau's The Room. A couple of days later, Fox and Ford visited Simmons again at the Sunset Marquee. Sitting by the pool, they reminded him about Tuesday's show. This time, Simmons agreed to go. I think the text sort of implies that Fox and Ford may not have been aware of Paul and Gene's trip to that Halloween gig. They'd be joined by Stanley, the stunning model B.B. Buell, Simmons' then current companion, Bingenheimer, and Hernando Cortright. B.B. Buell went on to be mother to Liv Tyler. If you don't know, now you know. By the weekend, Hollywood buzzed with the news that KISS had been on the prowl at Gazzarri's. Sunset Strip denizens shared stories of seeing the 2 dark-haired men at the club or in a booth at the Rainbow later that night. The boys, eager to hype KISS's interest in them, told members of their circle that Simmons and Stanley planned to attend their Starwood show. But among Van Halen and Boys fans, there was another reason for excitement about the gig. On that night, 2 of the best guitarists on the scene would face off. Michael Kelly, a Starwood regular, explains, everyone was talking about Eddie and George playing back-to-back. We thought it was going to be like Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. 2 gunslingers would fight it out, but only one would come out on top. Lynch, in particular, had something to prove after a personally disastrous 1975 double billing of the Boys and Van Halen. The first time I saw Eddie play was the Golden West Ballroom, Lynch stated later. He was amazing. He had a lot of fire and great tone. I was embarrassed for myself. I thought, this is ridiculous. I immediately went back home and started practicing. I stayed up all night saying, I sound awful. I play awful. As was the norm at the Starwood, the two bands on the bill would alternate sets. The boys would play first, followed by Van Halen. Then after intermission, the two groups would play again in the same order. Kelly, who was at the Starwood on that fateful Tuesday, explains that while it sounds logistically insane in this day, that's how it was done. Two bands, two sets per night, alternating. God, breaking down all those drums and then putting them back together. Good Lord. So it sounds like both bands did one set before Paul and Gene get there. And they do get there. They go sit in a booth, and people are like whispering and pointing and, you know, pretty much guessing that's, you know, they figured out who that is. And around 11, the boys go back on stage for their second set. White remembers that as a unit, the band did not perform well. Over the past few days, they'd rehearsed and rehearsed in order to be at the top of their game for Kiss, but White says that what happened instead was we burned ourselves out. That night, his voice was shot, and they were all tired. Kelly has a different take. He said, George is really killing it. When he can't be fully certain, he believes that this may have been the gig when George actually passed out briefly during the second set because of the combination of heat and his personal intensity. He was delivering the goods like he was possessed. Set is over. They all go they break down their gear. Gene Simmons heads to the backstage area. White remembers they came and hung out with us upstairs. They schmoozed. They schmoozed us. B.B. Buell was with Gene. He announced, we're taking a band back to New York to record for a new label we're starting. Then through the walls rumbled Roth's introduction of his band. Simmons recalled that he heard, all right, ladies and gentlemen, here they are from Pasadena. Simmons still hung up on the band's name because he thinks it's the worst name he's ever heard. Sounds too much like he told Jackie and Lita from the Runaways. It sounds like Van Heusen, the dress shirt company. He shook his head as Roth shouted, Van Halen! Out on stage, the foursome ripped into their opener. Someone starts announcing the band from Pasadena, and then David Lee Roth shouts the Van Halen part? That doesn't make sense. Maybe that's how they timed it. I don't know. Van Halen's stage volume soon made communication impossible. Van Halen started playing, White says, and then it was too loud backstage at the Starwood to keep talking. Simmons yelled, we're going to go out and see them. Simmons returned to the VIP area. The first thing I thought, he told Stephen Rosen, was that Dave looked like Jim Dandy, and they had a kind of old-fashioned look. But within two numbers, I thought, my fucking God, listen to these guys. By the third songs, Simmons was floored by Van Halen. So he gets it, finally. He sees them play. He notes they have quite a bit of choreography going on that he likes and he feels was probably, in his mind, influenced by Kiss. A photographer, Mary Garson, shot many of Van Halen's early promo photos, remembers that I was there the night at the Starwood that the boys played with Van Halen. Sorry, grammar. I was there the night at the Starwood that the boys played with Van Halen. Gene Simmons was there. The boys sucked. Van Halen had a great night. I thought Dave was amazing. One of David Lee Roth's old high school buddies, Steve Tortomasi, was promoting Van Halen's Pasadena Civic shows, said, I remember telling the guys, the night that Kiss came down, you guys did one of the best sets of your life. And I'd seen them play many, many, many shows from high school on up. So as soon as the band's done, Gene Simmons, without even talking to Paul Stanley, just taps Rodney Bingenheimer on the shoulder and then points towards the backstage area like, now. They go back there, hang out with the band, and he says, he wanted to come see them. He thought they were great, blah, blah, blah. He says, look, I'd like to help because I think you guys can make it. I'm not stroking you. I'm not interested in doing anything for myself, but I love your band and I'd like to help you. Are you guys on a label or anything? Do you have a manager? They shook their heads but mentioned that a certain yogurt manufacturer had recently offered to support the band. Please do me a favor, Simmons implored. Don't do that.
Other things I've found about the movie. Let's see. Producer Art Linson, the director of this film, but he was a very successful producer, still is. He's done things like Into the Wild, did some Sons of Anarchy, did Yellowstone, which is quite popular right now, in 1923, which is doing very well right now. He also did the Expendables, or no, excuse me, the Untouchables. Fight Club. So that's his thing. He only directed the 2 movies that I could find, and he's not terribly dynamic as a director, but I think he gets the job done. What I'm seeing so far in the wildlife, I like I said, I really enjoy Where the Buffalo Roam, but I think I enjoy it for how charming it is to me for being a piece of early 80s, middle of the road kind of cinema that doesn't go quite far enough. But there's something comforting about it, like a grilled cheese sandwich.
All those considerations for the audience will get eventually thrown out the window when Van Halen does get around to Van Halen 3. When they get that much further along, then it doesn't matter anymore. It's all about whatever can hold Eddie's attention in the studio, I think, is a little more up front there. There's also, what did I write? Oh, yeah. I noticed in stuff like Everybody Wants Some, David Lee Roth is doing, I made the Chuck Berry reference earlier, and I'm going back to the Big Bopper on that one. Big Bopper with, Chantilly Lace had his whole shtick on stage where he'd have a phone and he'd get an imaginary call from his girlfriend and like, you want what? Baby, that's what I like, like, oh, I got no money, honey. And then like hang up and like look at the crowd like, can you believe what I've got waiting at home? I don't know if I'm going to be able to handle it. And there's a little bit of that kind of a mentality with David Lee Roth, obviously, and a lot of loungy sort of Louis Prima, like, I'm here to like, not play a character that's not me, but still this part of my attitude that you hear in interviews is in my songs too. And I think I've had some note about like, he's more like he's in the captain's chair, rather than on the phone going, he's more like back in this, like in a recliner, a captain's chair with a cigarette and with a cigarette holder and a champagne, and he's talking to a woman. He's not talking to a woman at first. He's talking about a woman. He's talking about the line that goes at the back of the stockings, and I really like those kind of high heels too. As he's holding court, and then he's like, no, don't take him off. Don't take him off. He wasn't even looking at her, is what I see in my head. It's like the way he's delivering this. Oh yeah, that's right. She's don't mess up this picture I'm talking about here. And it's the acknowledgement. It's the acknowledgement of, yes, hot lady, but it's not quite the taking for granted objectification hot lady rap. It's more of a, oh no, I'm not going to let this go by. I'm acknowledging that you put this together here. This is not like a Ted Nugent song where this is all going to be over in 5 minutes because I'm just going to ravage you. This is a no, you came prepared, and I want to draw this out. Like I want this moment to live for a while, and we're not gonna like, I'm just not gonna just like rip this to pieces and go, go to town. I love that. It's so cool, and it's so casual and still in control at the same, in a non-overbearing way. There's never any like really lecherous, controlling vibe on this stuff from Dave. Like you don't feel like this. It's not threatening. It's just this sort of like, it's this presupposing that you've got the attention of the guy that you came to get the attention of, and this is sort of your reward. But it's still a show. Like, he's still directing things in his own little way, but not being overbearing about it, which is a weird, difficult balance to strike. And I keep saying that with Van Halen. I keep coming back to that in every aspect of what they do. They're just so natural. They're such naturals at striking these balances. Ironically, an album that wasn't nearly as good as Women and Children First. But we'll get to that in another episode, I'm sure, as well.
Nice.
It is
Nice little reference there.
dig there.
So what does David Lee Roth have to say about the Gene Simmons experience? Well, I have gone to archive.org and found his autobiography, Crazy from the Heat, and I have done a Control-F search for the name Gene Simmons, and it shows up on 3 pages. I'm just going to read from those 3 pages. How's that sound? One of the things I noticed right away is a little inaccuracy when he talks about what was recorded. Let's see. He talks about, how they never did take a demo tape to a company, never did solicit a manager or enlist the assistance of an agent. It was all based on, if we're that good, then it will work out great. If it doesn't work out great, it's because we're not that good. Standard operating procedure was always, to make a little demo tape, send it to the record company, it winds up on the guy's shelf, and his secretary doesn't answer your calls, and he gets 300 of these tapes a week. Again, my mindset was, if we're that damn good, and we thought we were, then every time somebody sees the show, they're going to tell somebody else, and they're going to both come back. But even word of mouth can have its drawbacks. There was a brief interlude in 1977 when Gene Simmons from Kiss came to the Starwood and saw us play to a sold-out audience and thought we were absolutely spectacular. And he said, "I'd like to make a demo tape." He was thinking of himself as a producer. He had a couple of artists he was producing, doing whatever in the studio. Kiss was at an all-time high. They were at their zenith. We said, "Sure, let's make a demo tape." We didn't have a clue. He flew us all to New York City. We made a demo tape, 4 songs, some of which later wound up on records. Running with the Devil, I believe, was on there. House of Pain wound up on the 1984 album. Now, if you ask Gene Simmons, it's a much longer list. And I went to YouTube and found the 0 demos, and it says 1976, high quality. It's on Van Halen Archive. That's the YouTube channel. The track listing is as follows: On Fire, Woman in Love, House of Pain, Running with the Devil, She's the Woman, Let's Get Rockin', Big Trouble, Somebody Get Me a Doctor, Babe, Don't Leave Me Alone, and Put Out the Lights. And that's closer to what Gene says in Van Halen Rising. I wasn't just going in and saying, okay, let's record. They gave me a cassette of the tunes. There must have been over 20 on there. I picked 13 to record. Didn't like Ice Cream Man. The last one, House of Pain, is on 1984, though it sounded much tougher then, much closer to Running with the Devil. Now, Dave's saying that he came to see them in 1977. This YouTube link for the demos all together in one video, sort of, one full-length piece, says recorded May 1976. These both seem to be wrong compared to the scenario in Van Halen Rising, where Gene and Paul go to see the Halloween show first, and then the following Tuesday go see the show with the boys in Van Halen. And it wasn't even like it probably was closer to like the 30, like that was closer to the Halloween, I suppose. I guess they had the Halloween party at whatever it was, Gazzari's, before the Halloween weekend or whatever the hell it is. So it would have been bordering on the 1st of November-ish, that following Tuesday in 1976. And famously, this recording session was kind of tough on Eddie because he wasn't used to doing, overdubs and things. He didn't want to, but they made him. It sounds very much like a contemporary New York style rock and roll album, like more like a Kiss album, but still a little bit, a little bit pumped up when it comes to the energy, because that's just how great Van Halen is with their energy. I think it's definitely worth listening to if you haven't. For any Van Halen fan, it's just a different way of hearing some of the songs you already know, and it's in a lot of ways the production sounds to me more like something you'd hear from, I don't know. I don't want to be too specific and cite the wrong kind of example because I can't put my finger on it, but to me it just sounds like mid-70s. More East Coast style hard rock production, like a Rick Derringer or not that I even know what coast or what part of the country Rick Derringer's from, but I mean like the production of, in a studio over there. Like the bass is louder, the guitars are not as dominant, the drums are not as dominant. It's like the vocals are all way up there, which sounds great. The bass like pokes through in a different way than you're used to hearing Michael Anthony's bass come through, which is fine, but it's just a little more stock 70s, where I feel like Van Halen's first album really kind of wrote the book on what hard rock production was going to sound like to a greater extent. The drums were more thunderous and less compressed, and the guitar had more wide open sort of low end to it. It also wasn't as like squished in. And I guess I say all this because, we're used to hearing Van Halen in the context of Van Halen albums, right? So this is just a strange sort of way of taking something you already know what it sounds like and then putting it through a different like machine. Essentially, we're just going to plug you into the standard hard rock production style of 1975-76 in New York City, and give you a very non-California sounding, it's not even too glossy. Like it's edgy. It's still the danger, that you love Van Halen for, and the wildness you love Van Halen for still comes through. So I think this is a good thing for them to sort of be given for free and then left with to sort of go, okay, when we're in the studio with Ted Templeman, I guess the story is, according to him, that they just said, yeah, okay, whatever you want, to everything that he said, and they came out with a totally different sound. Maybe they just liked the recording experience so much more than the New York Gene Simmons experience that they were like, let's just go along with this, and it's got to be better than what we've already got. Ted also said about the Van Halen 1 album, I know it's not called Van Halen 1. We can't help it, right? He also made executive decisions about the track listing. He put back the stuff that Gene Simmons didn't want to record, and he got rid of some of the darker sounding songs. I think one of them would have been The House of Pain. But the other one, I forget the name of it, was one of their earlier tunes, and he said they were both too dark sounding compared to where he wanted to go with it. And the newer songs that they had written, I think he liked the energy there. He didn't mind the darkness in Running with the Devil. He said that one was supposed to sound dark, and it was good in its own way. I personally, considering their history of cover songs they used to play and the bands they used to play with, I would assume that the darker stuff that he got rid of was probably a holdover from more of their influences, more of their, 60s and early 70s influences. And they just didn't, a lot of bands go through that phase once they get enough tracks for a full-length record. They finally become the band that they meant to be but didn't know it yet. The first Alice in Chains album is a great example of that. The second half of that album, Facelift, is a lot more steeped in their funky glam rock origins, and you can tell that, like, okay, they recorded this first album during a time when they had clearly made the decision to move away from that. Hence, the first 5 songs on this record being the ones that are pushed on the radio and MTV right now. So back to Dave's narrative, he says, we had a big meeting with his manager, Bill LaCoin, who was riding very high on the hog at the time. It was at his Madison Avenue office, high floor of the building. We sat in front of his mahogany desk, and he had his shoes polished by a little Italian man while he spoke to us. And he said to us, guys, I think the music is great, but I don't think the vocals hold up. I just don't hear the melodies, the hits that are required in this day and age. Now, pausing there, I will say that some of the vocals that I heard on the Zero demos don't have the melodic content that the final versions would. I've heard some examples of just like, yeah, it is Dave, like singing, screaming stuff, his high-pitched stuff, and holding out these notes with a very intense vibrato, more so than you're used to. It's not as smooth as he would become, and that's because after this experience and before going into the studio with Ted Templeman, he worked really hard in private vocal lessons and practiced every single day. Hence the fateful, it might have been Running with the Devil, I think is what it was, when Ted Templeman was like, God, your voice is just not gruff enough, it's not edgy enough, it's not really aggressive enough. And Dave's like, oh, well, I've been laying off beer and cigarettes for like the last 2 weeks to keep my vocals nice and sweet. And he's like, what? Well, knock it off then. And he like, go have a smoke and drink a beer. And he did. And he came and he sang the track, and it's the vocal that you hear on the finished version. So a coin goes on and says, we're not going to do this. Gene has to be busy with Kiss, and we can't work with you. We walked out of that office, and I felt terrible. Wow, had I let the band down? This is my first experience with somebody getting his shoes polished by an Italian guy on Madison Avenue. I didn't know what the Van Halens were thinking at the time. Perhaps they were buying this load of horseshit. There's no editor on. I want the money that this guy, whoever got the credit for editing this. I want that check. I will have done the same amount of work that he did. Just to fuck it. And this is all through his narrative. It's like there's a fairly coherent couple of sentences. There's a random aside, and then he's back on track to what it was he was talking about. I mean, I know what he's trying to say. This is the first time I've been in the office of a fancy, bigwig. But it's just a funny way of it's not a funny way of saying it. It could have been a funny way of saying it is, I guess, my problem with it. Like an extra sentence there would have helped connect it and made it sound as silly as he wanted it to sound. Turns out that Gene Simmons' true interest was in conscripting Ed Van Halen into their show in some form or another. Get him to play on a record. Get him to help write guitar solos. Get him into the band. So this dismissal was followed up by calls to Edward. Come on down. We're recording at Larrabee Studios in Hollywood, and we got a new song. We need a guitar solo. Come on down. I was always very fiercely protective of what we were doing as a group, as a clan, because there's always going to be pirates. There's always going to be carpetbaggers like Simmons. And I would show up with Ed at the studio. Simmons would look at me with horror, because I was onto his game way early. Which is funny to me now because I think about like what Kiss did in the mid to late 80s is they kind of copied what David they copied a lot of contemporary hard rock acts of the time, but it feels like, some of elements of David Lee Roth's solo career, kind of spurred that on. There were scenes like, oh, all you guys are invited to the big Kiss show down in the Forum, and I would show up and there'd be no tickets for me. The Van Halens would be inside, comfortably ensconced in the back room with Gene and his pals. Of course, I knew what was up, and I was super protective of the band at the time, or people like that would have picked us apart right away. In line with that kind of thinking, when we made our first album for Warner Brothers, Ted Templeman, the producer, approached Van Halen and said, I'd like you to play on the Nicolette Larson album. I got right between them. I said, no way. You're not going to run off with bits and pieces of the scenery before the play starts. Ed wanted to play on it. I said, great. But you got to put a question mark where your name goes. Got to keep it in one camp, a theory that has stood Van Halen well to this day. That's page 91. The next mentions of Gene Simmons are on page 228. The page or two before the next Gene Simmons mention, he says, when I see the Van Halens dysfunctional with that kind of anger, it's like looking at a Hezbollah freedom fighter, those people who have nothing else to fight for. And I'm very hesitant to even continue because my anger, continue engaging, I think is what, in the back and forth. Because my anger wells up. My emotional content is enough to stimulate a stadium full of people. My emotional content is enough to change what people see when they look in the bathroom mirror the next morning after my concert. I am not the master of self-control. I am not Mr. Peaceful. I don't own any peace symbols, and we don't burn any incense in my little room. So I'm very hesitant to get up and move across the face of this wave because I become angry. It's not a place I want to live. Nevertheless, it still pains me deeply to know that all of that hard work is going to be completely demeaned and belittled the entire rest of the way. It's the work of misguided spirits. So he's saying, you know, I'm an insanely powerful person, and I have to be careful with that power, essentially. This is music that could well feed and tuition my kids down the line. That's not going to be the case. I'm lucky that I'm smart enough to have found other ways to take care of my Cuban cigars and Junior's football lessons sometime down the freeway. Just a reminder that this book came out in like the mid 90s. I think it was around 96. When I left Van Halen, it was not something that I was delighted to do. I was not celebrating. I was not relieved. It was one of the scariest moments in my life. I perceived that Van Halen was heading towards catastrophe. So do you ride that plane all the way into the sand? I said no. We'd already been through a year's worth of the Hatfields and the McCoys with the bottle of moonshine in between. And I'm not a prince. I am not Mr. Not Guilty at all. But the chemistry between us was becoming morbid. I think this is a pretty astute observation. I think it's one of those things, you know, when fans bemoan the breakup of you know, or a split in the ranks of a band, it's like, you can have the band with a different singer or not at all. You're not going to get your way. If they could continue and everyone was happy with the original setup, then they would have, but they can't. You know, as I say, oh, what would Jim Morrison be doing today if he hadn't overdosed in the bathtub that fateful evening in Paris? He'd still be dead. He would have overdosed or finally fallen off of the top of a building at some point. You know, very soon after that, probably. Or maybe if he'd stayed in... See, there I'm doing it. It's pointless. Well, maybe if he stayed in France and in Europe and he didn't come back to America and, you know, didn't get back into the lifestyle. Because he probably would have pissed somebody off that stabbed him, you know, at some point. I'm like, well, maybe if he stayed mellow in Europe, he wouldn't be that kind of a personality. Well, then, yeah, he would have just stayed on drugs. Died from that. All right, back to Van Halen. He says, it was becoming threatening and non-productive. There you go. That's when you leave. You know, obviously the plane didn't go down. They moved on with Sammy Hagar, and they needed that. But so he got to do things his own way after he left as well, so they could both exist and eventually get back together. You can hear it in the music. It started turning melancholy right after I left. That's great. There's plenty of room for melancholy music, but it's not my personal constitution. Took me a long time to figure out what to do as far as staying in Van Halen. When I left, I had a screenplay that I'd been working on with a couple of other fellas, but no movie deal. As noted in another book, it's I think the Brad Talinsky book. It was kind of cringe-inducing what he had written, and it wasn't as he was fun and charming in a 3.5 minute music video, and not when you gave him all that extra time to write whatever he wanted. People didn't get it. It wasn't fun. It wasn't cool. That's someone else's opinion. I don't know what's in the fucking screenplay. I don't care. If you've read it and you've got it framed on your wall, awesome. Please call in now and tell me why it's fantastic, because I'd like to be pleasantly surprised. I did not have a movie company behind me. I didn't have any musicians. I had no equipment to rehearse with or anything. Well, whose fault is that, Dave? You got in the band because you were the only guy with a PA that they could rent from. It wasn't until some 3-4 months later that I had put together a band. It was sometime after I left Van Halen, but I had nothing to leap to. I had nothing specific that was beckoning or that promised to be greater than. It was a question of watching a real great bird auger in. And as time went by, there was more and more backbiting, more and more mudslinging, most of it coming from their vocalist and his management. I think that's a great point to make. If people wanted to blame Dave for so long, they got into it with Sammy too. Everything was Sammy's fault after he left, if you believe Van Halen's story. And here we currently reside 13 years later, some mudslinging, same kind of thinking from their camp. Oh, same mudslinging. So I guess the most critical decision I have to make is, do I really describe some of their carryings on the road, or do I continue to be the quiet guy? Oh, this is a real nice flower shop. Be a shame if something happened to it, like mobster insinuation. 99% of all the hijinks and carrying on was my contribution, but everybody had a proclivity. Everybody had a little sidebar to their story. I swear, folks, I'm getting to the Gene Simmons bit. I want to backtrack a little bit when he's talking about, his contributions being downplayed and the fact that that's going to affect, essentially implying that's going to affect his sales and his net worth and his well-being, because they don't want to, give it the proper respect or promote it. Two things that brought to mind. Number one, a Van Halen guitar tablature book from around 89 that I found on archive.org. It was part of a series that was kind of popular in music stores from Guitar for the Practicing Musician for a few years. It was called, Top 5 or 5 Best Of. There'd be a Metallica one in 1991, and it would have, think of the first 5 Metallica songs from the 80s and the Black Album that they would be trying to push, separately. For folks that didn't want to or could not afford to buy an entire $24.95, albums worth of guitar tablature, sheet music. Well, these were great for certain, young students and listeners of certain bands, because it's like, oh, here's the 5 I would have bought probably that book for, or the greatest hits book for, or whatever. Well, this Van Halen one, it's Eruption is the first one. And then that's the only thing from the David Lee Roth era. Everything else is from 5150 and OU812. Actually, 3 of them are from OU812 because that's the newest album at the time. And then, it's what? When it's, let's see, Eruption. So, sorry, the point I skipped over. The only thing from the David Lee Roth era doesn't have any vocals on it, so David Lee Roth gets no money for it or no credit for it. That's number 1. Number 2, Finish What You Started from OU812. Number 3, When It's Love from OU812. Number 4, Feels So Good from OU812. Number 5, Why Can't This Be Love from 5150. Like, 2 of these are like power ballad type songs that kind of rock, but they're not the kind of things that Eddie Van Halen fans want to learn how to play on guitar. This is only the guitar music. This is none of the other instruments. This is not like a score, so your whole band can like take this book and learn from it. So that's just publishing money in their pockets, from the new. And I assume that they probably got some kind of a better deal, record contract, or some terms of how much per album sale they're getting by the time OU812 comes out. So they want to, put those tunes in, I'm guessing. That's one thing that David Lee Roth's, complaint made me think of. Another thing that it made me think of was an interview I heard with John Five. John Five, who got famous playing for Marilyn Manson, and then Rob Zombie, and is now in whatever Motley Crue currently is in a state of being ish. He was a session guy in the 1990s and got commissioned to do a whole David Lee Roth solo album. He had to record it all in one weekend, and it has been locked up ever since. It has never been released. He's not even allowed to play it. He's not allowed to give anyone else copies of it. He could probably play it for you. This was in No Guitar Is Safe podcast by one of the editors of a prominent guitar magazine. And I found it to be a very interesting interview. He's not terribly interesting as a personality, I find. He's a lot of fun to watch on stage. I've seen his club shows solo. I've seen him with Rob Zombie. I think the guy's fantastic. He's got good stories when they get him to tell the stories. I'll say that. He doesn't have a very magnetic personality, it seems like to me. Seems like a real nice dude, though. Real nice. Worked really hard on his craft and is very talented and has never fucked anybody over. And to that, I say, huzzah. But it was a very high pressure last minute situation. He was hired to come into the studio within a couple of days and be responsible for all the guitar parts on an entirely brand new David Lee Roth album. And then it all went, and then it was over. That was it. It breaks my brain. It was after the Jason Becker phase of David Lee Roth's career because of, Jason's very unfortunate medical situation, which sucks. So back to Dave's narrative. I have to do this so you're not just listening to me being an audiobook narrator, and I'm not just ripping off, I'm not just selling my podcast for free as someone that just like reads you a book. So, but I want to be faithful to the spirit in which some of these people write, because I think it's important to hear it from their side and in their voice. So he says, it's unfortunate feuding has continued all the way up to the present because what Van Halen meant to a lot of people, and myself in particular, was very positive. What it meant in the early days, read, that time period that I was involved with the band is hanging in there like an Indian summer. It's still all over the radio, still in the magazines. People still have questions about the breakup. I guess the best I can say is, don't believe every syllable of everything that you read by everybody who wrote it. Go out and buy those records and see if you can hear the truth in the music. Well, yeah, that puts money in your pocket. That's my recommendation. Yeah, I'll hear the real story if I just listen to your vocals more, I guess. I don't know what he's trying to say. Some of those records you may have to buy twice, just in case. You want your best pal to listen in too, so you can discuss it more. Dolomite, motherfucker. I assume somewhere earlier in the book he established what he means when he shouts Dolomite, motherfucker, at you, because he says it at the end of the next paragraph, which is, isn't it curious what we read about Gene Simmons now that he has put out his book? Gene Simmons chasing after Ed, how he asked Ed if he wanted to join Kiss by 1981, 1982. There you are. Dolomite, motherfucker. At a Thanksgiving dinner, it must have been 6 years ago, we were talking about the band. And most of my family was at the table in Pasadena. My father said, "You mean you guys haven't communicated at all?" I said, "No, Pop, not at all." 2 days later, my pop calls me up and says, "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of calling Ed Van Halen." Well, this is a Roth kind of way of thinking. I'm going to help you whether you want it or not. I am going to help you even if it kills you. I froze because I knew what was coming. I said, "Pop, you shouldn't have done that." I said, "There's so much anger and hatred in the air coming out of those guys. Who knows what's going to be how that's going to be translated?" Lo and behold, a week later, there's a full page in the Star and in the Inquirer, Ed Van Halen saying Dave Roth is trying to weasel his way back in the band. He's destitute. Even tries to have his father call me. Who does he think he is? That kind of thing. I think the biggest victim of that page was my father. He was just trying to do what doctors do. He was being a dad. But that was seized upon and turned into a daytime soap. So I'm very careful as to how we approach each other. I always felt, let's protect the story a little bit. Let's protect the legend a little bit, because it was very positive. And I stayed back from the backbiting and the screw you and the you're a bad guyism and whatnot for a number of years. And then about 4 years ago in Howard Stern, I really laid into them, said everything that I thought at the time. I didn't say it quite as nicely. Their new lineup, to me, is not of interest. And Van Halen, without a guitar in his hand, is a crummy human being. Stern was great about that. He got the Ramones to fight with each other, too, after they broke up. Around this same era, as a matter of fact. They played their last show together in like 96 or 97. And, yeah, it is interesting. During the time that I think Van Halen 3 was coming out, I read an interview with... it was the Sammy breakup stuff, Eddie Van Halen in a Guitar World magazine, his story. And then I read Sammy's story in the next issue of the magazine. And they both described similar events from totally different perspectives. And it sounds like what Dave's talking about here too. Very similar to the Motley Crue breakup with Vince Neil. Band gives the singer an ultimatum. He can't fulfill the ultimatum. He gets, essentially kicked out. That's, I think, similar to what went down with Sammy. I'll probably have referenced something about the Sammy breakup from the Tolinsky book in another portion of either this episode or another episode. So I apologize to you if you've heard me talk about the specifics of a breakup and now I'm going, I think that's what happened, because the timing of these recordings is so far off. But hey, no one's paying me for this. I'm doing it out of love and desperate desire for attention from you, my wonderful, wonderful listener. I want you to know that I love you, or not so much you, as I've said in the past, as a idealized version of you that makes me feel good and attractive and appreciated. And smart. If you want to help out, please consider checking out the links in the description of this and all episodes. They have just simple stuff like a PayPal donation you could do for a one-time thing, or subscribe to the Patreon for more rock and roll history from a lot of different eras. There's always going to be some like 50s and then before rock and roll history, and I think every episode from, who knows, anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes worth. And I bounce around to other eras besides that, depending on what's caught my attention at the time. Right now, I'm going through some Crosby, Stills, and Nash stuff, as well as Beatles stuff and Rolling Stones, leading up to Altamont stuff. And there is an extra 4 hours of content for you for $3 a month. And that includes the backlog, of course, as well. As of this current recording, I am putting these out in blocks of 2 hours at a time, twice a month. And beyond that, please feel free to share this with somebody. Please consider leaving a like and a review or a comment on whatever platform you're listening to this on, as that would definitely help out. At least that's what every podcaster I listen to says, and I have gone 2.5 years without making that request of anybody. So I figure, why not throw one of these in here? It probably is a good thing if you as a user and listener alert the platform you're listening on that you have interacted with this podcast and would like other people to do so as well. That's it. No sponsors, no ads, nothing. No support from anybody else except for you nice people. Please consider chipping in. And if nothing else, check out my email in the description as well. If you want to send me a suggestion for a movie or a book, or an artist that connects a movie and a book, that would be fantastic. I'm not running out of subjects anytime soon. I've got stuff that I planned to do 2 years ago that I still haven't gotten to yet. But input is always appreciated.
Let's run through a bit of trivia that I found about the wildlife. It turns out that there's another Eddie Van Halen contribution that became a Van Halen song. AFU Naturally Wired was sort of demoed in this movie during some of the party scenes. There is... Okay, wait. The only film credit of actor Bryn Berliner, who played Jim's only friend, Tony. That still doesn't make any... I think what it is the photo in IMDb is the wrong kid. I think they've just put a picture of Ilan Michael Smith in there, and it's supposed to be the other kid with the vest that follows him around. We've got a cable installer that shows up in a certain point of the movie, who is leaving from the band Fear, who we've talked about twice now on the show. We've talked about him in our it's me. I have talked about him in my first Halloween episode originally. The Misfits and Fear on SNL. And then we talked about him some more on the Streets of Fire episode, where he's one of the henchmen towards the end. One of the street punks. There's an actor who appears in the party scene in The Wildlife, claiming to be the father of Chris Penn. It is Leo Penn, his real dad. Also, Leah Thompson had a nude scene that was cut out of this movie. God damn it. We do see a very nice lady, Janie Wright's very nice body for a little bit early on, because it's one of those movies. Would have been great if we could have seen Leah Thompson as well. What are you gonna do? Too bad. But nice to know she was up for it. What a great gal.
If you were a teenager in the 90s and you had to read interviews with Eddie Van Halen about those albums, it was not nearly as fun as if you grew up in the 80s, I'm sure, and got to read his interviews with the early stuff. Right. This is, I guess the only other thing I had written down there was just like, it's this kind of, it's presented as like this throwaway line, like, no. And as opposed to a song like Girls, 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 which would come quite a few years later, which would be all about a whole song about that little throwaway piece in this song. The other thing that I learned about this was, Eddie had an Ibanez Destroyer, like the more pointy looking, Gibson Explorer type guitar on the first album. He played it on the first album, but then he took a saw to it to like chop pieces out of it, make it look really jagged. And he did that to the extent that it kind of wrecked the sound of the guitar, and he stopped using it. Fast forward to Women and Children First, Eddie is friends with Chris Holmes from Wasp. I don't know when Wasp started. I don't know anything about the history of the band, but presumably they're a band at this point. Chris Holmes bought an Ibanez Destroyer because he saw Eddie play one back around the time of the first album, just to be like his hero. Eddie asks him if he can borrow it for this record, and he does. It's made of Carina. It's super just gorgeous sounding, and it's like better sounding apparently than the one Eddie, left himself with after he tinkered with it too much and chopped it to bits. So he plays it on the record, gives it back to Chris, and Chris is just like, the intonation's all weird now, and the strings are all jacked up, and he's like, I can't believe he said it. It wasn't an isolated incident. I've gone to shows and gone backstage and picked up his guitars, and he sets them up the opposite of how I set up my guitars. I say, you want things to play easy. Eddie doesn't. Eddie makes it difficult compared to what you would think for how effortless his playing is. So, fun fact.
Wow.
And I think of the Destroyer on Everybody Wants Some because the little like claymation figure plays it in the scene in Better Off Dead. Like there's a whole burger scene where like a little burger gets up and starts playing guitar to that song, and it's playing a red and black and white striped Ibanez Destroyer instead of the more Strat style Eddie Van Halen guitar. So
Right.
Which I guess was a $200. The Frankenstrat originally was like $200 worth of parts that he put together, and the Destroyer was actually a better sounding guitar.
Wow.
You wouldn't know it by the amount of replicas of the Frankenstrat that people have bought over the last 50 years. But yeah. It sounds silly to call like Van Halen to use the phrase restrained and tasteful, but when I look at the track listings and I look at the running time, like nothing really goes over 4 minutes. Most of the songs are between 3 or 4 minutes. They get to the point and they get out. Like it's just before, obviously we're in the era before the like super long synth intro to Oh Pretty Woman, but we're starting to branch out more on this album than we have on previous ones with some different sounds. I wanted to touch on, let's see, there's the Destroyer. Oh yes, Tora Tora. And I am going to read straight from my notes. It starts out sounding like a Black Sabbath riff. It sounds very doomy. It's very like, but a little kind of actually heavier in its own way. The word Torah, from what I found out, is a 2-syllable Japanese code word used to indicate that complete surprise has been achieved. So there was a movie, Tora Tora Tora, that was about Pearl Harbor, and I guess that was some element of the Japanese code being used. Funny enough, by coincidence, it also means tiger. Tora in Japanese. Then they go from that into Loss of Control, which sounds like a Slayer riff. So they go from Black Sabbath to, you know, and of course it's broken up with some craziness, but then they go back to while Dave's doing his thing on the like sounding like a helicopter pilot or calling in on a radio or whatever. A great modern, I won't say modern as if it's being interpreted, but a more current cover of this. Video footage came out of Scott Ian playing this with Mr. Bungle in the studio, Universal Studio, as a little Eddie Van Halen tribute after the week that Eddie died. And it's very cool. And you see like Mike Patton doing the thing with a CB radio or with a megaphone or whatever it was, I forget. And he's doing it, and it's mad. Like, I've never seen Van Halen do it. I've never seen footage of them doing this song. But to watch like Scott Ian from Anthrax with, you know, the rest of the guys in Mr. Bungle, who I don't know the names of. I'm more of a Faith No More guy. But Mike Patton doing his, like, shtick as David Lee Roth over it, it's something to behold. And it gave me a better appreciation for this song, for sure. Like, I had to really, really, I don't know, take this one in. I was more excited to hear it this time than I had been previously.
Don't forget to visit our refreshment center during the intermission or any time. You love the tasty array of snacks we have to offer. So will the youngsters. Everything is quality and so good.
So the Cranky Pants wannabe librarian in me has been putting this part off for a while because I kept jumping to this one chapter in Van Halen Rising and thinking, oh, I'm going to come back to this part and this part. And then because I do these things in a sort of initially like a haphazard fact-finding sort of way, flipping through books, just reading whatever catches my eye, putting bookmarks in, and then going back in a more sort of organized kind of way to see what I've missed. This chapter, Unleashed, starts around, let's see, this is chapter 13. Spring of 1978, talks about Black Sabbath. They were planning their 10th anniversary world tour for Never Say Die. Ozzy had actually had some input here when it came to choosing the opening act. And he said that, you know, we don't want to go through this thing where Kiss steals the show from us again as the opener like they did back in 1975. He wants somebody, you know, less likely to do that. So the quote is that he put out a mandate to their agency to hire a bar band from Los Angeles as support. And that's what they went and did. And then the book says, May 16th, this is 1978, Osbourne bassist Geezer Butler, drummer Bill Ward, and guitarist Tony Iommi stood backstage at Sheffield Hall preparing for the first show of their month-long UK tour. So a month. Out of curiosity, Ozzy and others made their way to the side of the stage to take in the end of their opener's act. They arrived just in time to catch the guitarist's solo spot, a withering sonic assault that dropped all jaws all over the venue. The Sabs then watched in stunned silence as Van Halen, as powerful as a Sherman tank, rumbled through You Really Got Me. Back in the dressing room, the four Birmingham natives sat together, exchanging concerned looks. As Ozzy Osbourne later explained to keyboardist Don Airey, "We were just too stunned to speak. We sat there going, that was incredible." Soon after, there was a knock on the door and the best-looking man in the world walked in and said hello. He introduced himself as Dave Roth. At that moment, Sabbath knew they were in deep trouble. Then it cuts back to February 28th. And it discusses the Montrose and Journey tour. It talks about touring in March of 1978. And then a page or so later, it goes back to the Sabbath tour. And it's like it introduces the whole concept of it from scratch again. After a short transatlantic headlining run, Van Halen hooked up with Black Sabbath on May 16 in Sheffield. Edward and Alex, who'd cut their teeth on Sabbath, surely felt the weight of history on that first night of the Sabbath tour. But all those thoughts faded after the quartet opened their set with the 1-2 punch of On Fire and I'm the One. Right in the middle of their second song, however, disaster struck. Edward's guitar went dead for some minutes, bringing the set to a halt. The band would recover and finish on a strong note, but they undoubtedly remained frustrated and embarrassed the technical difficulties had disrupted their Sabbath debut. They mention also that Sabbath's set ended disastrously. The PA broke down after an hour, following periodic blips throughout the earlier part of the set. Bill Ward manfully treated us to an unamplified and spontaneous drum solo, while the other members sheepishly trudged off stage. I was right at the front, says Paul Wilkinson, and could hear Bill shout, "Fuck it!" as he dumped his sticks and trounced off to join them. There was a long pause, then the house lights came up. Someone made an apologetic announcement, and 2,000 Sabbath fans were left to make their way dejectedly home. Departing audience members were speculating that Van Halen had sabotaged the PA, but Wilkinson wrote, "Most of us realized such a step was hardly necessary. Van Halen were incandescent. Sabbath were merely in decline." And I'm going to get back to the Journey tour, but still, the narrative of the book goes on to talk about how, their first album slowly has gone gold during this tour, and they celebrated in Aberdeen, Scotland, in the lobby of the hotel. Edward, in a drunken effort to commemorate the band's achievement, tracked down some gold paint and set out to redecorate the hallway walls. The rest of the band added flourishes to some portraits with shoe polish pulled from a vending machine. Needless to say, as Roth recounted, police escorted the band out of the country saying, "Don't ever come back." Then it says in mid-June, Van Halen temporarily parted ways with the Masters of Metal and headed for Japan. They play 8 dates there in large crowds and theater-sized venues. And then they rejoin Black Sabbath in America. They do some Midwest shows, and they actually perform everywhere from the Superdome as an opening act for the Rolling Stones to the Armadillo World Headquarters in Austin, Texas. But it's funny because the narrative is so herky-jerky. It talks about, those bookings by premier talent to capitalize on their growing success on the road, and their album going big in lots of other countries, but then to capitalize on the success back in America and I would presume a lot more radio airplay and attention because they got a #1 record. It talks about that tour being booked, and then it says on June 28th, Van Halen prepared to depart Japan. Their next destination was Dallas for the Texas Music Festival with Hart, Ted Nugent, and Aerosmith. And this is in front of 80,000 fans in the Cotton Bowl, the largest audience to this point in Van Halen's history. So it's a small gripe, but the way it's laid out, it's not... it's sort of like, hey, Van Halen is going to leave Japan on June 28th, and they're going to play in late August with Black Sabbath, and then it goes sort of backwards to talk about the shows they played in between that were booked for July and parts of August as well, before rejoining with Black Sabbath. Now back to Journey. This is a tour that starts March 3rd of that year. Again, this is after the explanation of the first impression that they made on Black Sabbath that happens months later. It was Van Halen going first, then Ronnie Montrose, and then Journey, whose album Infinity had just come out in January. And they're referred to in this book as being like Montrose in a transition period that sees them evolve from a fusion act to a mainstream rock band. Now, only 3 days into the tour, on March 6th, they suddenly find out they've got a night off the next day in Madison, Wisconsin, because the Orpheum Theater stage couldn't accommodate 3 bands. So their manager makes a few phone calls. They find a local nightclub called the Shuffle Inn, which was happy to book a band whose debut single, You Really Got Me, was making its way into the top 40 on Billboard's Hot 100 singles chart. By showtime, that whole place was sold out. No fear from the guys in Van Halen about like that this might be perceived as some sort of demotion, so it might be perceived as like they're not the big time, players that they should be if they take a night off from the Journey tour to play a very, very large nightclub. Not at all. And they're happy to be making money. They're happy to be playing for an appreciative audience and, get more word of mouth out there. And they get a nice write-up in the Emerald City Chronicle saying the band mounted the stage and launched a full-tilt assault. A rough-edged, rowdy, and raw set. Van Halen made no pretense of being a hot new national act that doesn't play clubs anymore. Quite to the contrary, this group grew up in bars and feeds off the energy exchanges best found in a close-up crowd. And then they do 2 encores, and Dave Roth blasts people in the crowd with with a couple of bottles of champagne as they leave the stage. And the boys spend the next 2 days in their hotel, the Madison Sheraton, just destroying as much as they can, chasing each other around with fire extinguishers, and chucking a TV set or 2 out windows to the streets below. Got a few visits from the Madison Police Department during that stay. Now, that's the end of the first week of the Journey tour, and they work really hard at becoming, the main attraction of this 3-act bill that they are first on. So, after a little while, the initially disinterested headliners start paying attention to Van Halen. Their manager, not Noel Monk, but a guy named Burl, who is related to Milton Berle. I forget how. He's like a nephew or something. Mentions that 3 of the guys from Journey would stand on Edward's side of the stage. They would only come out of their dressing rooms when Edward would do his guitar solos. And every night he would do something different. And they would sit there and crack up in the wings, just being blown away by this young upstart. By March 17th, in Louisville, Kentucky, Van Halen is officially starting to attract more attention from the Journey audience, who are making sure to show up in time for the opening act because word has gotten out. And they start getting frightened, according to certain sources, of Van Halen by the time the Louisville show happened. They had started to turn against Van Halen after they saw they were getting blown away. They started sabotaging the PA. This is credited to a gentleman named Broderick, who was evidently part of the road crew. I keep flipping back the previous pages to see if there's a first name for this Broderick person, and I don't see one. So they started, because he says, there's nothing I could do. I didn't have a headset, so I couldn't say to someone backstage, look in the back line, something's unplugged. So he's probably like one of the front of house or something. We were just really screwed, and that was it. They could have invested in some walkie-talkies, I would think. I think that would have been I think by the time you're on a tour like that, there should be some communication between the front and the back. But what do I know? It says that Eddie said, they fucked with us. They gave us a hard time, so we gave them a hard time back. And Alex would say, when Journey would be on stage playing, we used to go in their dressing room, eat all their food, mess around with their old ladies. Edward's girlfriend, Kim Miller, confirms this, saying they would try to get Steve Perry to come into their dressing room just to mess with him. It was Alex and the others' goal to try and make him cry. But Edward seemed to like Neil Schon. We would hang out with him and his wife at the hotel. Now, then they get to Philadelphia, at the Tower Theater, March 24th. This fan base is a little more strong for Journey, Philly. And, what can you say about Philly? They threw batteries at Santa Claus during a Christmas parade. They deserve everything they got from Bill Burr 15 years ago, or however long ago that rant was. I think he said something he said many, many things, but one of my favorites was something along the lines of the amount of historically fantastic, African American boxers you've had come out of this city, and you build a statue to one fake white one. So Van Halen gets kind of a hard time at this show. Some booing, some heckling, but doesn't really shake them up too bad. But David Lee Roth sits in for an interview with Rob Patterson of Cream. And Cream's one of those magazines that it's like, Cream's just like a lot of the famous people I admire. I've just terrible personality and terrible attitude, but important and captivating to me when it comes to their story. And they treated a lot of bands like shit because they were tired of magazines sucking up to rock stars. So while they were cooler, in my opinion, than anything going on at Rolling Stone at that time for about a 10-year span, they, I'd say they were provably wrong about a lot of things, especially the way they treated the Runaways, who were in Cream magazine quite a bit. If they liked you a lot. If they didn't like you, they treated you like crap, but they would still have you in the magazine, it seems like. That's kind of the vibe that I get. The documentary about them is okay, but it's not enough. It's like that ZZ Top documentary that they put out on Netflix. That should have been 8 hours long. Same with the Cream documentary. And I watched Cream promote that on Instagram for 2 years before the fucking thing came out. Didn't even find any, because it was like a what do you call it? Like a crowdfunding promotion. And I never really saw enough extra features or footage, presented as any enticement to give them any money. So I watched it when it came out, loved every second of it, but was annoyed that it was edited the way it was. There's got to be tons more footage that they could be putting out there. I don't know, maybe eventually. But it says, "Face the facts, kiddos," Patterson wrote in the July issue. When it comes to heavy rock and roll, the kind of stuff that sounds like a herd of dinosaurs engaging in some prehistoric S&M, a little bit of calculated outrageousness goes a long way. So along come Van Halen, led by two Dutch siblings on guitar and drums, who grew up in Pasadena and fronted by one David Roth, whose struts and screeches emit a crotch-splitting intensity the likes of which haven't been seen since Jim Dandy Mangrum invented the now passé cockwalk. Oh, and I should clarify, this interview takes place in New York the day after the Philadelphia show. I can admit when I'm wrong. Got ahead of myself there and made a mistake. You can trust me. Don't you ever not trust me. I have more gripes about the timeline in this. Not the timeline. The storytelling style, perhaps, in the following pages. So they're going to play with the Rolling Stones, as previously mentioned. As previously awkwardly mentioned earlier in the book. And then when it does get to that part of their tour, there's predictably some weird, wild, crazy, stuff going on, playing a show that huge for the very first time for Van Halen. And the story for this part starts off with the fact that they're also opening the same show for the Doobie Brothers, which are label mates on Warner Brothers with them. This is in New Orleans, Louisiana, and Alex decides to rent a Cadillac. The author says, which he drove with abandon. Okay, remember that. That's the description of how he drove it. That's all we kind of get, I believe. Back at the hotel, he and his drum tech, Greg Emerson, ran wild. Michael Anthony explains with a laugh. Alex and Greg loved to drink back then. Greg was one of those guys who was always up for doing something crazy. He and Alex would say, let's do something nuts. And I'd say, no, I'm not doing that. So nothing specific there. He drove the Cadillac like a wild man and then back to the hotel where they acted like wild men, but no specifics as to what it is that Michael Anthony wouldn't do. So that's not a good story. The bassist adds, when we were in New Orleans on the first tour, I remember the crew kept bringing back all these girls who were actually guys to the hotel. When we got up that morning, Greg had 2 black eyes and was looking rough. He said he got in a fight, but it was just as likely he walked into his hotel door when he was drunk. Then they go to meet Mick Jagger, later that day, and he's embarrassed because he's got 2 black eyes, even though he was. That's the story. So, what? I believe that bears. Okay, none of that bears printing in a book unless you're going to ask for some more details there. Am I wrong? Am I wrong about that? Like, what does Michael Anthony know about the women that were being brought backstage by the road crew, and why? Like, that sounds like a pretty fantastic story that's not being told there. Like, oh, the crew were just not good at recognizing, what drag queens or, transsexual women or cross-dressers was the more pertinent, relevant, accurate term for what society would call, a man dressed as a woman at the time, presenting as a woman, I suppose. And is it just like, is it like, well, they were the easiest ones to find in the crowd because they were taller than the other women, or they were the most glamorous looking because they were all, their hair was amazing and their makeup was really was on point, and their dresses were fabulous, unlike most of the girls at the rock shows. What is the story there with them bringing these women that were actually men? And then what happens, Michael? Is it like a case of mistaken sexuality, and like the road crew was wanting to party with them, but oh no, they're not what we thought. Oh, boo. And then they sent them on their way, or did they just or did the band party with them too? Were they having a great time with these like men in drag? Was it fun? Was it silly? Was it a bummer? What the fuck, dude? And why were they pulling them in? When? Who? Where? Jesus Christ. And then to jump straight from that and then Greg woke up with 2 black eyes. Like, did he get in a fist fight with one of these people? Did he get taken out? Did he get too handsy with some of them? And they're like, no, I'm saving this for Van Halen. And he was, going for it. And he got punched in the face. Oh, but he probably just walked into a door. Well, then why print the story? Why? God damn it. God damn it, Greg Ranoff. If I could get you to sit for an interview and ask you what the hell influenced some of these choices in your book. So they're getting ready for this big Superdome show, I guess. And let's see, Roth explains that they, had played for some big crowds. They were feeling more, quote, anticipation than nervousness. I mean, we know these tunes. We know we can do them well. Hey, we've been doing all these songs since way back. We can read comic books on stage while we play because we know them that well. The reality is, this is their first time ever playing for a crowd this huge. 83,000 people. And these are not people that are just like coming in off the street one at a time. These are people who are dying to get in to the dome hours in advance. And they know that they have like one shot at securing a really good place in the crowd to stick to until the Rolling Stones come out on stage. So, they're, as soon as the gates open, they flood the place, they pack it in, and as was the practice at the time for these huge shows with very little regulation as to how you space people out and how many tickets you could sell and how many people you could crush in there, they just got their spot right as close as they could and squished in and waited for the Rolling Stones to come out. So Van Halen has a captive audience of a this packed house. Roth remembers that it was incredible to be standing up in front of 83,000 people and asking them a yes question and hearing 83,000 go, yes! The sound almost blew us over backwards. It sounded like a jet taking off. Also mentioned is that they had there was this big huge like World War II surplus bombshell that Eddie would like use on stage and he had like some of his guitar effects in it. I guess Mick Jagger like walks on stage. Michael Anthony mentions this the afternoon of the show, while they're sound checking at the Superdome. And Michael Anthony's jaw hits the floor. Jagger looks over at Van Halen's equipment and points at this rig and says, what's this bomb thing? A starstruck Eddie Van Halen explains that he kept some of his guitar effects inside the bomb shell. And Jagger says, well, we won't be needing it on stage. I guess he didn't want anything too visually, distracting or arresting that would help Van Halen be, more memorable than the Stones at any cost, apparently. So, Van Halen plays that set. They get an encore. The next day, David Lee Roth asks Alex when he'd be returning his rented Cadillac. And this is the text straight from the book. Remember, we haven't heard anything about this Cadillac since it was rented and driven back to the hotel. Roth explained to DJ Jim Ladd. By the way, Jim Ladd has conducted a lot of amazing interviews over the years that you can find on YouTube and in other places, especially one that he does a really nice history of the Doors, and I think I included those links in my second Doors episode. I totally forget the name of his. He has like a series of band histories and like retrospectives and radio interviews. It's really, really cool. Roth explained to DJ Jim Ladd what happened next. The next morning around breakfast time, I said to him, "You'd best call the rental place." He said, "Yeah, I better." So he called up the rental place and said, "Hey man, you got to come down and pick up this car yourself. I ain't even driving it back to the shop." Guy goes, "What's the matter?" "The right mirror is out of adjustment, the right turn indicator doesn't work, and the right door don't even open." Guy said, "Right door doesn't open. I checked the car out myself before you took it. Why won't the right door open?" Al goes, "Car's lying on it." Whackity schmackity doo. I would like to hear the story of what happened, how the car got that way. It's not a particularly descriptive tale. So Alex got the car, and then the next day, David said, "You better call the place and tell them you're not bringing them in the car." It doesn't say David knew that Alex had done and Greg had done X, Y, and Z to the car, and therefore it would be a fool's errand to even try to get it out on the highway because it's not street legal anymore the way they had left it because they did things to it. But no. All right. So again, I think that's enough of my pulling from Van Halen Rising. I believe I've kind of set up my impressions of that book pretty well early on. It's if you're a Van Halen completist and you want the stories from the early days, from the people that were there, the friends from high school, the friends of the girlfriends, the parents, the whole scene, it's all there for you, including stuff that's been included in other Van Halen, histories as well. The big standout stuff. Because I had seen these other people do it in their own way. But then Could This Be Magic? Great novelty song, like Ice Cream Man or Happy Trails. But I notice that's the slide one we were talking about, right? Am I right?
The what?
Could This Be Magic is the one, women and children first.
Yes. And you hear the rain.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I love the slide playing on this because it sounds like nobody else. I've never heard any blues slide player sound the way Eddie sounds. It supposedly was just Ted Templeman going, "Why don't you try a slide on this song?" And it's so, like, the notes they move fast, they're kind of short. He's not sustaining them. He's not playing typical blues slide lyrics at all. And it's another one of those, it's Eddie Van Halen. He's a complete original. You just hand him
a different thing to play, and he plays it in his own specific way that nobody else could probably come up with, you know. And it's not like he's picking notes that are like outside the realm of human experience, but I've just never heard a blues slide guitar sound like that. It was very, very original and cool, and that was, I think that's the one that the woman named Nicolette sang some high vocal harmonies on. We get into Simple Rhyme. Simple Rhyme sounds to me like a bridge between Led Zeppelin's Presence and Ozzy Osbourne's like Blizzard of Oz, like the kind of stuff you hear on Goodbye to Romance or I Don't Know. There's something about, and this is what I was saying about this being the Van Halen album that things start peeking out that are not as Van Halen-y, but they're awesome. Like I guess that's not a good descriptor. They're very surprisingly just, they're just a success. Like everything they do sounds successful to me, to my ear. Like, oh, I didn't know they, you know, or if I knew, I'd forgotten that they had done songs that sounded like this. It's very, you know, the vocals are stacked in a different way. It sounds very airy and anthemic in that sort of, you know, Led Zeppelin-y, later Led Zeppelin, you know, your Houses of the Holy on out, Presence, Physical Graffiti kind of stuff. A nice surprise, but so off-brand that I don't think I'll go back to it much. You know, that's like, well, that's not what I go to Van Halen for, but it sounds like it's being done by experts. It sounds like they're really trying new things in the studio, and it's paying off. But I'd rather hear I'm the One. So,
yeah,
which we'll get to. Which we'll get to in my perfect 10.
Oh yes.
I think
perfect one.
I think
the song already knows it's the one.
Yes. So there's an ending riff in this tune that they meant to build it out into a whole song, and then they just didn't get around to it, and they just left it tacked on the end of this tune. That didn't become anything.
Which tune?
The last track on the album.
Simple Rhyme.
Simple Rhyme. There's so much more to get into when it comes to Van Halen and their history, but I think it's a good time to wind it down with some nice reminiscences from a trusted confidant of Eddie Van Halen's, and that would be Steve Lukather. And if you're not totally familiar, he is the guitarist for the band Toto. He's done a ton of other musical projects as well. Very, very musical human being, workhorse of a man in the industry for sure. So this is taken straight from an interview that is featured in the Eruption book. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I think there's some really nice stuff I want to sort of pinpoint here. Leaving out the intro, how they first met. The interviewer asks, "Did you guys get together to jam?" He says, "Not very often. Usually I would play him recordings of unfinished rough mixes that I was working on, and he would do the same for me." That right there speaks volumes about the kind of creatures these guys are. These guys work in their studios. These guys work, you know, they're mad scientists. You know, they're not live jammers. You know, they're not constantly, you know, this is not like a guy like Warren Haynes or, you know, the kind of guitarists that are just up for all kinds of just collaborations on the spot, or, you know, like guys in jam bands just, you know, do cool stuff at the drop of a hat. The fact that they wanted to just sort of play each other their mixes of ideas they've already formulated is kind of interesting to me and kind of cool. I think they are very much creatures of habit, similar habits, it sounds like. I got to hear Jump in demo form.
way before it was considered for a record. He told me David Lee Roth hated the song because it had synthesizers. The irony was that it became Van Halen's biggest record. First time I heard it, I knew it was a fucking #1 smash, and I told Ed that Roth was out of his mind. Turns out I was right that time. I know when Eddie was still alive, there was some Guitar Magazine interview I read where, people were sending in their own questions, and someone asked, what's your favorite Van Halen song, or your favorite song that you've written? And Eddie was just like, well, Jump seems to be the one that connects with the most people, so maybe that one. Like, he was very much not attached to any one of his compositions, but the more I learned about how personally he seemed to take that dismissal by David Lee Roth, the more that resonates me as a real, like, yeah, I was right about that one. I was right. David Lee Roth was wrong. David Lee Roth is wrong. I'm going to keep saying things to indicate David Lee Roth is wrong. As time goes by, sometimes without directly saying it. So he says, Ed really topped his game with 1984. I thought the first album was the shit, but geez. He was real proud of it. Al's playing was amazing. Everybody sounded great. It was one of the best albums they ever did. The interviewer mentions him building 5150 in his home, and it kind of helped unleash his creativity. And Steve says, Ed wanted to mess around the way he wanted to mess around. Ed was always tinkering like no one I've ever seen. I'm the kind of guy that if you give me a model to build, I'll have a bunch of pieces left over. I can relate to that. I'm an idiot. Ed was a genius. He was always soldering something or putting something together, making some sort of Frankenstein piece of gear. I was enamored by that because it's so not me. His workshop was always open. That was the first thing you'd see when you'd walk into 5150. There was his workbench with all his tools and projects. He was always taking a neck off of something and putting it on something else or swapping out pickups. He was always looking for something new, even if he got only one song out of it. That's why he was Eddie. He didn't do things the way everyone else does. Guitar lessons would have been the worst thing in the world for him because the teacher would have told him he was doing things wrong. For Ed, doing things wrong was the right way to do things. Interviewer says, the first record the two of you ever did together was Michael Jackson's Beat It. Was it your idea to get Eddie to play the solo on that song? If you don't know, Steve was responsible for the majority of the guitar that you hear on Michael Jackson's Thriller album. I believe he's not the only one, but he did a lot of work on that. Steve says, no, that was entirely Michael's idea. A lot of people don't know that Michael was also a rocker. Sorry. As a person who was in, kindergarten or first grade, when my mom got the Thriller album and I just put it in my little portable cassette player and just rewound, beat it, and played it over and over and over again, sitting outside by myself, that makes me smile. That makes me deeply, deeply happy. He loved Van Halen and he loved Toto. That's why he hired us to work on several songs on his record. I should say that was like the only hard rock song I heard until many years later. Well, not many. Until the Transformers, the movie soundtrack came out and I got that. Then I heard a lot of hard rock. Up until then, it was like my 50s rock stuff from movie soundtracks and then Huey Lewis and the News. You all need to know this about me. I knew Eddie, but I wasn't just going to give him his number. They had to go through the right channels. I wasn't Ed's agent or manager. Ed wasn't all that up on Quincy Jones and what he did. He was asking me, who's this Quincy dude? I told him that he was a really heavy cat and that he should do it. It was ironic we both ended up playing on the same record together. Ed later called me up and said, I just played on your record, Beat It. And I was going, I know, we had to redo it because you cut up the tape. He started laughing. What's the story behind Ed cutting up the master tape? We recorded a version of the song at Westlake Recording Studios, which is where Michael recorded the entire album. And by the way, if you're curious, if you already know a lot of this stuff, but you want to know more from a technical perspective, there is a book written about simply just the recording of the Thriller album by a producer and engineer that worked on it, who is not one of the guys you hear the name of much, not Quincy Jones, not, you know, that kind of a thing. But he was there for the recording and the tracking of the album. And it's like, if you want to know what microphones they used for everything, that's the one to check out. I'm sorry, it's not on the top of my head. I bought a copy of it 2 years ago and gave it to Dan Tyson. Ed recorded his solo later at Sunset Sound, so not at Westlake Recording Studio. Michael had already recorded 5 separate vocal tracks. They spent a lot of time working on his vocals because they wanted it to sound as good as possible. Those finished first-generation vocals were on a 24-track tape that we gave to Ed so he could record his solo. Either Ed or his engineer, Don Landy, cut up that tape because Ed didn't want to record his solo over the original backing part where Quincy Jones, producer, and Michael wanted him to play. He just edited the tape to create an entirely new section with chord changes that he liked better. The problem is, back then, we would record one track with the SMPTE code, Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, time code, for synchronizing one 24-track recorder with another 24-track recorder. Oh my God. God damn it, Eddie. That allowed you to record more than just 24 tracks. When you cut the tape, the SMPTE code doesn't lock up to the master tape anymore. Quincy called me and drummer Jeff Beccaro and told us to go to Sunset Sound and record all of our parts all over again because he didn't want to lose Ed's solo or Michael's first-generation lead vocals. Jeff had to make an entirely new click track with drumsticks so he could play his drum part. He did that and nailed his drum track on the second take. Then I had to cram my guitar tracks onto it, and I also played bass. We sent the tapes back to Quincy, and he said, "It's too big sounding. It's too rock." I thought that since Eddie was on the track, I better crank up some Marshalls and record quadruple rhythm tracks. Quincy explained that he wanted the song to get airplay on R&B radio as well as rock radio. So he asked me to play through my small Fender amps. I did it again like that, and that's the version that's on the record. I'm honored to be playing guitar and bass on Beat It. It's one of the biggest records of all time. What did you think of Ed's solo? The solo was like a collection of everything that Eddie ever did before, crammed into 20 seconds. Harmonics, tapping, whammy bar dives, super fast tremolo picking. To me, it sounds like he just went through his solo a couple times, and that was the take. I don't think that a whole lot of thought went into it. He just played it and was probably thinking, I don't even know what I'm doing this for. I never knew Ed to labor over anything. So I think he was just goofing on it. But even when he was goofing, great things would come out of him. They mention Eddie playing on a couple of his solo albums, and Steve says, Ed always wanted to do interesting things, although his bandmates weren't real thrilled about him doing stuff outside of the band. That was still a bone of contention when I got him on my first solo album, Lukather, 1989. But Al is my friend too, so it was cool. I didn't abuse my relationship with Ed. I wasn't going, ladies and gentlemen, Eddie Van Halen on my album. I would never take advantage of his name like that, and I promised him I never would. Our friendship meant more to me than anything else. Ed wrote the riff for Twist the Knife, which was something that he wrote for Van Halen. And parentheses says, I Want Some Action, originally recorded as a demo for 5150, but never released. But he gave it to me instead. He played bass on the track, and I played guitar. But I had to set up the guitar the way he told me to. He went, look, you tune the guitar like this and play it like this. I had to tune the guitar up a whole step and replace the guitar's low E string with an A bass string tuned to a B. My guitar neck looked like a fucking bow and arrow, but it worked. I had to play all these false harmonics, and it took me a few seconds to get into Ed's head. God damn it, Eddie. Oh, this is amazing. The way he writes and plays and how he feels time, where he thinks the beat is. He did all this trick rhythm shit. It was just brilliant. They ask him how he ended up doing background vocals on For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. Hey, my first Van Halen album. I just happened to drop by the studio. I'd often just drive up the hill and go right in since I knew the code to Ed's security gate. I'd go over there and hang out for an hour or two. They were recording vocal tracks for the album, and Ted Templeman was there. Ted said, we need a third voice. Lukather, get out here. It wasn't a big thing. I didn't take any money for it. I sang a few oohs and ahs. I got to be on a Van Halen record. That was good enough for me. People, asked if I played guitar on that album. Of course not. Why would I play guitar on a Van Halen album when they've already got Eddie? Give me a break. Skipping ahead to the last bit for you gearheads, we're going to talk some guitar designers and manufacturers. He used to work with Valley Arts, and I think one of the guys from Valley Arts was Don Grosh, who went on to do his own company in Broomfield, Colorado. And I'm more familiar with that side of kind of where Valley Arts went, because I worked in a music store for a long time that sold Don Grosh. Incidentally, the manager was a huge Steve Lukather fan as well. So that's probably why I know these things. Your Music Man signature model guitar came out a few years after Ed's Music Man signature model. So we're talking, so Ed's came out, I want to say, around for Unlawful Carnal Knowledge. He had ditched the sort of super strat ideas and gone to that body shape. And then when he left Music Man, they retained the right to that shape, and they called it the Axis. And he went on to PV and then eventually Fender with the Wolfgang models that were sort of a variation on that with a carved top instead of a flat top. Aren't you glad y'all know this? Or aren't you glad I'm saying these things if you're more of an expert than me and you're going, no, Jay, that's not the order that they went in. I apologize if that's the case. But I definitely recall the pound cake and runaround videos with the Ernie Ball with the quilted maple top. Gorgeous. And I remember the Van Halen 3 era with a white PV Wolfgang, and then him switching over to the Wolfgang brand in conjunction with Fender Musical Instrument Company many years later. Probably around the time of the David Lee Roth reunion for Another Kind of Truth, which is a fantastic record. If you've been holding off checking it out and you want to hear Eddie playing with that kind of fire again for the last time, highly recommended. So let's see. Music Man came out to do with Ed's guitar. They were recording me to work with them too. I went to Ed's house while they were finishing up his guitar. They were choosing pickups. They were voting on the neck pickup, and it was a tie. So they asked me to be the tiebreaker. That was a bigger responsibility than I wanted, but I offered my opinion, and that's the one they went with. They gave me prototype number 3, a purple one with gorgeous quilted maple for my efforts. I still have that guitar and cherish it to this day. I'm going to play it out on my next tour. I'd had my own deal with Valley Arts at the time, but that fell apart in 1983, shortly after they sold the company to the Koreans. The former head luthier at Valley Arts, Dudley Gimple, had been working for Music Man for a few years, so it made sense for me to work with Music Man. Dudley designed Ed's guitar, and he designed my Luke model too, which is my favorite guitar. And it's interesting that now I realize that Music Man was there's a Fender connection there too, because Music Man was a company started by Leo Fender after he left his own company and moved on to start building amplifiers and other instruments outside of. I'd have to go back and reread my Fender history books. I have multiples. And you know what, folks? I think you're going to hear a bit of that in the near future on the Patreon episodes. That's right. I just realized that. It's a good time to plug the Patreon for more of this type of thing where I'm reading some of the in-depth bits of, I don't know, rock history or in-depth interviews with people about very specific things and giving my own little asides. But it's an interesting circle of destiny because he goes from Music Man to PV and then back to Fender Musical Instrument Company to do the Wolfgang stuff before he died, Eddie. Let's see. There's a final question about remembering Eddie, and he says, he always had a big smile. He'd greet me with a hug and a kiss. It was fucking beautiful. We'd sit down and talk about life. We wouldn't talk about what kind of strings we were using or boring guitar shit. We would cry on each other's shoulder, and we laughed a lot. We shared so much, a lot of positive moments. It was the best memories ever. He was like a brother. He was Eddie, the greatest guitar player of all time. At least that's what I think. Nobody can argue that Ed was one of the greatest of all time. That's a given. And there we go, folks. Thanks for being here for the second Van Halen episode. There's a lot of love going into it. a lot of smiles, a lot of happy stuff that I want to thank you for being here for. Thanks for giving a damn about rock and roll, and thanks for giving a damn about creativity and how things get made and how people do the things they do. Thanks for giving a damn about movies. If you want to suggest some movies or some books or some artists for me to cover on the show, please send an email to justtheworstever@gmail.com. Twitter is now not a thing that I do. It's become a nightmare, more so than it used to be. So hopefully I don't forget to take out the link to the Twitter in the description. Also consider supporting in some way. There's a PayPal link. There's obviously the Patreon, like I said. You know, I don't have ads. I don't have producers. No sponsors. I don't call you family. I don't pretend like we're best buddies. I'm not here to take the place of a real life human interaction for you, as a lot of YouTubers will try to do, or a lot of podcasters will try to do, because they are emotional predators. And I generally don't make you sit through conversations with, guests to take up lots of extra time and to create more content more easily and let you sit there and listen to us talk about our day or current events. The show is pretty much designed to be evergreen, so if you go back through the last few years, you should be able to find things you can still listen to today without having any current event framing ruining it for you. Oh yeah, also, thank you for being here to listen to all my music demos that I recorded in my living room. Generally off the top of my head. They're riddled with mistakes that I have painstakingly edited out for the most part, but it helps me feel better about my musical output to know someone else is hearing it besides myself. Remember always, rock and roll is the best, and so are you.